There comes a moment in every struggling woman's life when the weight of everything she's carrying finally settles on her shoulders all at once, and she understands with terrible clarity that she has nowhere left to turn. For Margaret Ellen Hollis, that moment arrived on a raw November morning in the kitchen of her rented single-wide trailer just outside Greenville, Kentucky, with a foreclosure warning from the propane company in one hand and a past-due hospital bill in the other. The trailer smelled of burnt coffee and the faint sweetness of the bruised apples she'd bought on discount 3 days earlier. Outside, the wind moved through the bare tobacco fields that stretched beyond her gravel drive, rattling the aluminum skirting like something trying to get in. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She was 46 years old. She had a daughter in her senior year of high school who still believed, somehow, that things were going to turn out all right. She had a son stationed overseas who mailed what little he could spare. She had $68.42 in a checking account that had been overdrawn twice in the last 3 months. And she had a letter, folded twice and placed carefully under a chipped saucer on the counter, from a lawyer in Owensboro informing her that her late Uncle Ellis had left her his property, and that she was welcome to come and claim it whenever she pleased. The property in question was not, as the word inheritance might lead someone to imagine, a house with a porch and good bones. It was a tobacco barn. One barn. 17 acres of tired, sloping ground that hadn't been farmed in nearly 2 decades. A pump house with no pump. A collapsed corn crib. And at the center of it all, an enormous, black-planked, sagging tobacco barn that Margaret had last seen when she was 11 years old, holding her Uncle Ellis's hand while he showed her how the rows of burley hung from the rafters like dark, drying banners. Everyone she had told about the inheritance had laughed. Not cruelly, exactly. Just the way people laugh at something they consider hopeless. Her sister Darlene, calling from her comfortable brick ranch in Bowling Green, had said, "Honey, that barn is older than the 2 of us put together, and Ellis couldn't even afford to re-roof his own truck the last 10 years he was alive. You'd do better setting a match to it." Her ex-husband Roy, when he'd come to pick up their daughter Kayla for his weekend, had stood in her kitchen with his thumbs hooked in his belt loops and said, "You know what that is, Marg? That's trouble with property taxes attached. That's what that is." Even Kayla, sweet, hopeful Kayla, had said, "Mom, I looked it up. Old tobacco barns don't even sell as teardowns anymore. The wood's valuable, but who's going to pay to pull it apart?" Margaret had listened to all of them. She had nodded. She had even, for a while, considered calling the lawyer and telling him to dispose of the property however the estate saw fit. What she could not bring herself to do was sign the papers that would let it go. Because Uncle Ellis had been, for a short and shining window of her childhood, the one adult who had truly believed in her. She remembered him in flashes now, as grief makes us remember the people we didn't see often enough. Ellis Hollis had been a bachelor farmer, long and narrow as a fence post, with knuckles the size of walnuts and a voice that ran low and gravelly as a creek in summer. He wore the same brown canvas coat every winter of his life. He read his Bible at night and the Farmer's Almanac in the morning. He grew the best burley in the county 3 years running in the late 1970s, and then, after something happened that nobody in the family would ever fully explain, he stopped selling at market. He kept farming, but he did not sell. He had outlived 2 brothers, 1 sister, and both parents. He had, in his final decade, grown quieter and quieter, until even Margaret's mother had stopped calling him because, as she put it, Ellis doesn't talk. He just listens and then hangs up. When he died in his sleep at the age of 83, the county coroner had needed to break a window to get into the old farmhouse because Ellis had bolted the doors from the inside. There was no will on file at the courthouse. There was, however, a sealed envelope in a safety deposit box at the Farmers and Merchants Bank in Owensboro, and that envelope had Margaret's name on it. That was why, on that raw November morning, Margaret set down the propane bill, set down the hospital statement, and picked up the lawyer's letter for the 4th time. She read it slowly. Then she walked to her daughter's bedroom door and knocked. Kayla was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor in her pajamas, studying for an exam. She looked up, pushing her glasses up her nose, and Margaret saw, as she always did, the ghost of her own younger face in her daughter's features. "Baby," Margaret said, "pack, eh?" Weekend bag. We're going to go see Uncle Ellis's barn. Kayla did not argue. Kayla, unlike everyone else in Margaret's life, rarely did. She only said, "Are we going to be okay, Mom?" "I don't know, sweetheart," Margaret said. "But I need to go stand on that ground before I decide what to do." 3 hours later, her old Ford Ranger rattled its way up a rutted dirt lane under a sky the color of wet tin. The truck had 243,000 miles on it, a cracked windshield, and a transmission that shuddered every time Margaret shifted into second. The heater worked only when it felt like working. Kayla sat in the passenger seat with a thermos of black coffee between her knees and a notebook on her lap, because Kayla took a notebook everywhere the way other girls took their phones. The property, when they reached it, rose out of the overgrown fields like something a storybook had forgotten. The farmhouse itself was small and weather-beaten, its white paint gone to gray, its front porch sagging on one side where a post had rotted through. Behind the house stood the barn. The barn was huge. Margaret had forgotten how huge. In her memory, it was the size of a country church. In person, it was the size of 2 country churches set end to end. Its long, dark-stained vertical planks rose nearly 30 feet to a peaked tin roof streaked with rust. The sliding doors at either end were easily 12 feet tall. The whole structure leaned, ever so slightly, to the east, like an old man listening toward his good ear. Kayla climbed out of the truck and stood with her hands in the sleeves of her hoodie. "Mom," she said, her breath clouding in front of her. This is a lot." "Yeah," Margaret said. "It's beautiful, though, in a sad way." Margaret had not expected her daughter to use the word beautiful. She looked at her, surprised, and Kayla gave a small, embarrassed shrug. Look at the wood. Look at how tall it is. It's like a cathedral for tobacco." A cathedral for tobacco. Something in Margaret's chest, which had been tight as a wound spring for months, loosened by just a hair. The lawyer, a kind, round man named Mr. Teague, met them at the farmhouse an hour later. He had driven up from Owensboro in a tan sedan and wore a tie in a shade of green that had gone out of style before Kayla was born. He handed Margaret a ring of keys, a folder of deeds and tax documents, and, finally, the sealed envelope from the safety deposit box. "Your uncle," Mr. Teague said, "was a private man. I only met him twice. But he was very clear about one thing. He wanted you to have this place, Mrs. Hollis. Not your sister. Not your cousins. You," he said, and I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget. Margaret is the only one who ever stood still long enough to listen. Margaret had to turn away for a moment and pretend she was looking at something in the distance. When Mr. Teague was gone, Margaret and Kayla went inside the farmhouse. It was cold. There was a coating of dust on everything, but no real filth. Ellis had kept his home clean even in old age. There was a single recliner in the front room, a wood stove, a tiny kitchen, a bedroom with a neatly made iron bed, and shelves of books. Bibles, almanacs, paperback westerns, and, surprisingly, a full set of encyclopedias from 1967. Margaret opened the envelope at the kitchen table while Kayla lit the wood stove. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, covered in her uncle's slanted, careful handwriting. "Margaret, if you are reading this, I am in the ground and you are standing in my kitchen. Good. I always hoped you would come back. I am leaving you everything I have, which is not much to look at. The house is sound. The land is tired, but it will come back if you rest it. The barn is older than my grandfather, and it will outlive us both if you are kind to it. There is something I never told anyone. Not your mother. Not my brothers. Not a living soul. I kept it quiet because I was afraid, and because I wasn't sure what to do with it, and because the older I got the heavier it felt, and I decided a long time ago that it was not mine to spend. Go into the barn. Go to the curing room, the one on the east side, behind the stripping room. The one that I always kept the big padlock on. The small brass key on this ring opens that lock. Pull up the floor. Start at the corner nearest the east wall, 3 boards in from the door. Do not tell anyone what you find until you have thought about it for at least one night. Sleep on it. Pray on it if you are the praying kind. Then do what you believe is right. I am sorry I could not leave you more in life. I hope what is under those boards helps." Ellis Margaret read the letter twice, then 3 times. Then she folded it very carefully and slid it back into its envelope, and she sat for a long moment looking at the wood stove, where the first flickers of flame were beginning to curl around the kindling Kayla had stacked. "Mom," Kayla said, watching her face. What does it say? Margaret considered, for just a second, showing her the letter. And then something in her, some old, deep instinct, told her to wait. It says he loved us, Margaret said. It says he loved me. And it says there's something in the barn he wants us to see. Kayla's eyes lit up. Like a mystery? Like a chore, Margaret said, because she did not yet want to let herself hope. Probably old tools. Maybe a lockbox with some tax papers. You know how he was. Can we go look now? Margaret almost said no. It was getting dark. The barn would be colder than the house. They were tired from the drive. But Kayla's face, that hopeful face that had spent too many months watching her mother try not to cry at the kitchen table, was brighter than it had been in weeks. Get the flashlight out of the truck, Margaret said, and put on your hat. They crossed the frozen yard together, gravel crunching under their boots, the dead tobacco stalks in the neighboring field whispering in the wind. The big barn doors were padlocked, but one of the keys on the ring Mr. Teague had given her fit. The lock was heavy and cold in her hand, the hasp groaning as it pulled free. Margaret slid the door open with both hands, leaning her whole weight into it, and then she and Kayla stepped inside. The interior of the barn took Margaret's breath away. She had forgotten. She had truly forgotten. The scale of it. The way the ceiling soared up into darkness and the last gray light of afternoon filtered down through narrow gaps in the plank walls, striping the dirt floor like the bars of a gigantic harp. The air inside was cold and dry and still smelled, faintly, of decades-old tobacco, a sweet, earthy, almost sacred smell that had soaked into the wood until the wood itself was made of it. Rows of tier poles ran the length of the barn at different heights, all of them empty now, but Margaret could close her eyes and see the hands of Burley hanging from them, leaves spread like dark wings. Oh, Kayla said softly. Oh, Mom. I know, Margaret said. They walked the length of the barn slowly. The floor was packed earth in most of the main aisle, but there were wooden sections laid over the dirt where work areas had once been set up. Along the south wall, Margaret found the stripping room, a large rectangular space separated from the rest of the barn by plank partitions, with long wooden tables still bolted to the floor. It was the place where, in the old days, workers had sat and stripped the dried tobacco leaves from the stalks and sorted them by grade. In the corner of the stripping room, there was a door she had never noticed as a child. That's the curing room, Margaret said. I thought the whole barn was the curing room, Kayla said. The whole barn is a curing room, Margaret said. But some farmers built a smaller sealed room inside, for the top-grade leaf, for the stuff they wanted to cure slower and more carefully. Or, she hesitated, for the stuff they wanted to cure private. The door to the small curing room was reinforced with 2 crossbeams and fitted with an enormous iron lock, the kind of lock you saw on old jailhouse doors. The small brass key from Uncle Ellis's ring fit it perfectly. Margaret turned the key, and the lock opened with a satisfied, heavy click that seemed to echo up into the rafters of the barn and fall back down around her shoulders. She pulled the door open. The small curing room was no bigger than a bedroom. Its walls were lined with tongue-in-groove planks darkened almost to black by decades of smoke and time. The floor, unlike the rest of the barn, was made entirely of heavy wooden planks, each one easily 2 inches thick and a foot wide, laid across joists she could feel under her boots. The room smelled different than the rest of the barn. Older, closer, like a cellar that had not been opened in a very long time. Margaret shone the flashlight around. Nothing. An empty room. A single hook in the ceiling where something, a lantern maybe, had once hung. A water stain on one wall. That was all. She knelt in the corner nearest the east wall. What are you doing? Kayla asked, kneeling beside her. He said, 3 boards in from the door, Margaret murmured. She counted. 1, 2, 3. The third board was, on closer inspection, subtly different from the others. The nails in it were newer, shinier. The head of the board had been scored very faintly, a small notch cut into the grain that you would never see unless you were looking for it. Margaret's heart, which for months had beat only in anxious, shallow flutters, began to beat differently now. Heavier, slower, like something waking up after a long sleep. Mom, Kayla whispered. What is it? I don't know yet, baby. Margaret went back to the truck and returned with her uncle's toolbox from the front porch, the one she had spotted on the way in, a battered metal thing with a hammer, a crowbar, and a flat pry bar inside. She chose the pry bar. She slid it under the end of the scoreboard. She leaned on it. The board came up with a long, dry, reluctant groan. Beneath it was another board. A second layer, set crosswise to the first. Her heart beat harder. She pried up the second board, and the third, and the fourth, and now she was into the subfloor, and now she was looking down into a space that should not have existed. Beneath the floor of the curing room, nestled between the joists, was a cavity. A deep, deliberately constructed cavity, lined with what looked like oilcloth to keep out moisture, the kind of cloth Ellis would have used to wrap engine parts or bundle tools. And in that cavity, stacked with the neat care of a man who had spent his whole life putting up tobacco in tidy rows, were objects. Many, many objects. Margaret's flashlight beam trembled. She had to steady her wrist with her other hand. "Mom," Kayla said, very quietly. "What is that?" Margaret reached down. Her fingers brushed cold, hard, smooth metal. She closed her hand around the edge of something rectangular and heavier than anything she had expected to find in a barn floor. She lifted it out into the flashlight beam. It was a bar. A dull, dense, yellow bar. It was about the size of a paperback book, a little thicker, and it was stamped, faintly along the top, with a seal she could not fully read in the weak light, and with numbers, and with the word "fine," and with another word that made the barn around her seem to tilt and then steady itself again. Gold. Margaret sat back on her heels. The bar rested heavy in her two hands. Her breath came out of her in a long, soft cloud. "Mom," Kayla whispered. "Mom, is that real?" "I don't know, baby," Margaret said. Her voice did not sound like her own. It sounded like the voice of a woman who had, for the first time in longer than she could remember, forgotten entirely about the propane bill and the hospital statement and the overdrawn checking account. "I don't know, but I think maybe it is." She leaned the flashlight forward and angled it down into the cavity, and what she saw there made Kayla's hand find her own in the dark. There were more bars. Many more. They were stacked in neat rows, separated by slats of wood to keep them from scratching each other, and the rows went back into the cavity further than the flashlight beam could reach. There were also smaller objects. Cloth pouches, tied with leather cord. And, set against the far wall of the cavity, a squat, rectangular metal box with a hinged lid, the kind of box Margaret had seen in war movies, an ammunition box, green-painted and battered. Margaret slowly, carefully, set the first bar back down on the floor beside her knee. Her hands were shaking. She did not want to touch anything else. Not yet. Not until she understood what she was looking at. "Kayla," she said, "listen to me. I want you to go back to the house. I want you to lock the door behind you. I want you to put more wood in the stove, and I want you to stay inside until I come get you." "Mom, what is that?" "Is it really? Go, baby. Please. Just for a little while. Mama needs to think." Kayla, to her great credit, did not argue. She only looked at her mother once, long and hard, with an expression Margaret would remember for the rest of her life, a mixture of fear and wonder and absolute trust. Then she stood up and walked out of the curing room, and out of the barn, and Margaret heard the distant soft slap of the farmhouse door closing behind her. Margaret sat alone in the curing room with the gold bar in front of her, and the barn settling around her, and the wind moving through the old planks overhead, and she began, very quietly, to cry. She cried not because she was happy, although later that would come. She cried because for the first time in 8 months, she was not afraid that they would lose everything by the end of the quarter. She cried because somewhere in the cold Kentucky ground, a quiet, bony old man in a brown canvas coat had chosen her, out of everyone, to give this to. She cried because everyone, every single person in her life, had told her this barn was worthless, that Uncle Ellis had been a broken recluse, that she was wasting her time, that this inheritance was a burden and not a blessing. And she cried because she understood, sitting there on the cold plank floor with a single gold bar warming in her palms, that she had come within one decision, one shrug, one phone call, of letting Mr. Teague dispose of the property, however the estate saw fit. She could have lost this. She had almost lost this. She put her hands over her face, and she let herself weep for a while, in the quiet, kind of hollow way a person weeps when they have been holding something in for a very long time, and finally find a safe place to let it out. Then she wiped her face on the sleeve of her coat, and she picked up the flashlight, and she leaned forward into the cavity in the floor, and she began, very carefully, to count. She did not get far before she had to stop. The bars, insofar as she could see and count in the narrow beam, were stacked 4 deep and 6 across in the front row, and then row after row extended back into the cavity. If each row was the same, and if there were as many rows as it looked like there were, then there were hundreds of bars under the floor of this barn. Not tens, not a handful, hundreds. She did not know exactly what a gold bar was worth. She knew, vaguely, from stories on the evening news, that gold was expensive. She knew it had been climbing for years. She knew a single 1-ounce coin she had seen once in a pawn shop window had been tagged at over $2,000. These bars looked bigger than an ounce. Much bigger. She picked up the first one again and felt its weight. It had the solid, dead, heavy feel of something that did not belong in a floor, that belonged in a vault somewhere, behind thick steel doors, guarded by men with earpieces. She looked at the stamped markings on the bar more closely, tilting the flashlight. She could make out, now, 99.99 fine, and below that, 1 kilo, and below that, a seal she didn't recognize, what looked like a small crest or coat of arms, and a series of numbers that had to be some kind of serial number. 1 kilo. Margaret did not know the conversion off the top of her head, but she knew 1 kilo was significantly more than 1 ounce. Her stomach turned a slow, weightless somersault. She set the bar down again, very gently, the way you might set down a sleeping child. Then she did what any sensible person who had just discovered something she did not understand would do. She replaced the boards. Every single one. She hammered the nails back with Ellis's hammer, matching the old holes as best she could. She spread dust from elsewhere in the curing room over the seams. She stood up, walked out, closed the door behind her, and clicked the big iron padlock shut. She slid the outer barn doors closed. She replaced the padlock on the main barn. She stood for a long, long moment in the yard, her breath rising in long, slow columns under the darkening sky, looking at the huge, leaning shape of that barn against the bruised purple light of the evening, and she thought, Uncle Ellis, what in God's name did you do? That night, in the farmhouse, she and Kayla ate cold sandwiches at the kitchen table by the light of a kerosene lamp. Kayla did not ask, at first, what her mother had found. She only washed Margaret's face and ate quietly, and finally said, Mom, you're not okay. I'm okay, baby. You're not. You look like you did when Grandma died. Margaret set down her sandwich. She looked at her daughter across the yellow pool of lamplight. She looked at this girl who had worked a part-time job every weekend for the last 2 years to help with groceries, who had stopped asking for new clothes, who had quietly canceled her own plans for a school trip to Washington because she did not want to tell her mother they could not afford it. She looked at her, and she thought about Uncle Ellis's letter, and she made a decision. Kayla, she said, I need you to promise me something. I need you to promise me that whatever I tell you tonight, you will not tell anyone. Not Dad. Not Grandma Darlene. Not your best friend. Not anyone. Not until you and I have had time to figure out what to do. Can you promise me that? Kayla's face went very still. Mom, you're scaring me. Don't be scared. It's not a bad thing. I think it might be. I think it might be the opposite of a bad thing. But I need to think about it. I need us to think about it. Can you promise me? Yes, Mama. I promise. Margaret reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. Kayla's fingers were cold. Margaret's fingers, for the first time that day, were warm. Uncle Ellis, Margaret said slowly, hid something under the floor of that barn. And I think he hid a lot of it. And I think it's worth something, Kayla. I think it might be worth more than anything our family has ever had. Kayla stared at her. What kind of something? Margaret took a long breath. The wood stove ticked. The wind sighed against the old windows. Somewhere far off, a hound dog barked once, twice, 3 times, and then was quiet. Gold, Margaret said. Gold bars. Real ones. I'm almost sure of it. Kayla did not scream. Kayla did not cry. Kayla did what Kayla always did, which was to go very quiet for a long moment while her mind worked through things. Then she said, How many? I don't know yet, Margaret said. A lot. More than I could count in the time I had down there. And there's other things too. A metal box. Little pouches. I didn't open anything else. I guess I was scared, honey. I didn't know if I was seeing what I thought I was seeing. Why would Uncle Ellis have gold bars under a tobacco barn? I don't know that either. Do you think he? Kayla hesitated. in the careful way of a smart teenager who did not want to accuse her own blood. Do you think he got them in a bad way? Margaret had been thinking about exactly this, all through the quiet drive of the pry bar into those old boards. I don't know, baby, she said. I don't think so. I knew your Uncle Ellis a little when I was young, and whatever else he was an honest man. But I don't know. That's one of the things we have to figure out. That's why we can't tell anyone yet. Kayla nodded slowly. She was, for a 16-year-old, remarkably composed. Then, after a while, her composure broke, and a tiny, disbelieving, almost reverent smile lifted one corner of her mouth. Mom, she said, are we rich? Margaret laughed. It came out of her like a wet cough, startled and a little hysterical, and once she started she could not stop for a full minute. And Kayla started laughing too. And then they were both laughing and a little bit crying in the yellow kerosene light. Two women at the end of a long dirt road, while outside in the dark the enormous old barn held its secret for one more night, as it had for so many nights before them. I don't know, honey, Margaret finally managed. I don't know, but I think things might be about to change. That night, lying in Uncle Ellis's iron bed under a pile of old quilts, with Kayla breathing softly on the cot across the room, Margaret lay awake for hours. She thought about the propane bill. She thought about the hospital bill. She thought about Kayla's college fund, which had never existed in any meaningful sense. She thought about her son overseas. She thought about the trailer with the peeling aluminum skirting. She thought about her sister's voice on the phone saying you'd do better setting a match to it. She thought about the way the town she had grown up in had, over the years, quietly stopped expecting much of her. The way the ladies at the church had started using the voice they used on widows, on her. The way her own mother, before she died, had sometimes looked at her with a sort of weary, disappointed love. And she thought about Uncle Ellis. Ellis, who had watched her as a child, saw something in her that no one else did, and at the end of his long, quiet life, had decided she was the one who should stand on this ground and be given the choice of what to do with what he had hidden. Do what you believe is right, he had written. Margaret did not know yet what was right. She did not know where the gold had come from. She did not know what it was worth. She did not know how to sell it, or whether selling it was even the right thing to do, or whether, somewhere in the folds of that ammunition box under the floor, there were papers that would tell her why it had been put there and what her uncle had expected her to do with it. What she did know, lying in the dark in her uncle's old house, was this. For the first time in 8 months, she was not afraid. She was something else. She was awake. Outside, the wind moved through the bare tobacco fields, and the great old barn stood at the center of them, silent and leaning and full of hidden weight, and Margaret Hollis closed her eyes and slept more deeply than she had slept in nearly a year. The first thing Margaret did, when she woke at dawn to the sound of a rooster from the neighboring farm, was decide that she would not, under any circumstances, rush. She had spent her whole life watching people around her rush, and she had noticed, over 46 years, that rushing almost never produced a good outcome. Her ex-husband, Roy, had rushed into a second mortgage to buy a bass boat in 2008 and lost both the boat and the house by 2010. Her sister Darlene had rushed to marry a man who sold above-ground pools and now lived with the quiet, clenched disappointment of a woman who pretended every Christmas that her life was what she had wanted. Margaret herself had rushed exactly once, at 19, to marry Roy in the first place, and she had spent the next 20 years slowly paying for that single moment of speed. Whatever was under the floor of that barn was not going to disappear in a week. It had been there, in all probability, for decades. It could stay there a little longer while she figured out how to handle it. She made coffee on Uncle Ellis's old gas stove, in a dented aluminum percolator she found in the cupboard, and she sat at his kitchen table with his letter spread out in front of her, and she read it again. Slowly, carefully, every word. I kept it quiet because I was afraid, and because I wasn't sure what to do with it, and because the older I got the heavier it felt, and I decided a long time ago that it was not mine to spend. That sentence, she realized, was the key to everything. It was not mine to spend. Ellis Hollis had not found that gold in a ditch. He had not stolen it. A man who had stolen it would have spent at least some of it, somewhere, over the course of a lifetime. A man who had stolen it would not have written to his niece, at the end of his life, that he had decided it was not his to spend. A man who had stolen it would not, she suspected, have told anyone at all. No, whatever that gold was, Ellis had believed, for whatever reason, that it belonged to someone else, or to something else, or to a purpose, and he had carried the weight of it, silently, for years and years and years. Margaret folded the letter and slipped it back into its envelope, and she made herself a list on the back of an old feed store receipt she found in a drawer. 1. Do not tell anyone outside this house. 2. Do not touch anything else in the cavity until I understand what's there. 3. Find out if Ellis left anything else. Papers, a journal, a ledger, anything. 4. Find out what those bars are worth without going to anyone local. 5. Figure out who Ellis was, really. Kayla padded into the kitchen in her socks, her hair a tangled halo around her sleep-creased face, and read the list over her mother's shoulder. Number 5 is the hard one, Kayla said. I know, Margaret said. Can I help? Baby, I think you have to. They spent the next 3 days at the farmhouse, and in that time, Margaret Hollis began to learn her uncle in a way she had never been able to learn him in life. She went through his bookshelves, his dresser drawers, the cigar boxes on the top shelf of his closet, the leather satchel hanging from a nail in the back of the pantry. She did not find any more gold. She did not expect to. What she found instead was a man. Ellis had kept a small black notebook in his bedside drawer, and in that notebook, in his same slanted, careful hand, he had recorded the weather every single day for 41 years. November 14th, 1982. Hard frost. Wind NW. Cold rain toward evening. Page after page after page. Margaret flipped through years of it. It was beautiful, in a plain, patient way. It was the record of a man who had paid attention. He had kept seed catalogs from the 1970s, annotated in pencil. He had kept letters from her own mother, tied in a bundle with kitchen string, going back to the 1960s. He had kept, in a shoebox under his bed, photographs. His parents on their wedding day, his brothers in uniform during Korea, a picture of Margaret herself at about age 8, standing in front of this same barn with her hair in pigtails, squinting into the sun. And in the bottom drawer of his dresser, wrapped in an old flour sack and tied with twine, Margaret found a ledger. The ledger was plain. Green cloth cover, nothing written on the outside. Inside, on the first page, in Ellis's hand, was a single line. The Hollis Matter. Begun September 1st, 1979. Kept honestly. Margaret sat down on her uncle's bed with the ledger in her lap, and Kayla came and sat beside her, and together, in the pale morning light coming through the old lace curtains, they began, very slowly, to read. The first page of the ledger gave up its secret slowly, the way Uncle Ellis had given up everything in his life slowly. In his precise pencil script, he had written a date, and beside it a single line, and Margaret had to read that line twice before she understood what she was looking at. September 1st, 1979. Found the strongbox in the southwest corner of the lower field, under the old oak that came down in the storm. 3 feet deep. Rusted shut. Took me 2 days with a hammer and cold chisel to open it. Inside, 87 bars. Cloth pouches of coins, 7 in number. 1 oilskin packet of papers. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Kayla, reading over her shoulder, went very still. Ellis had not stolen the gold. He had found it. He had found it in his own field, under a fallen oak tree, almost 50 years ago, when he was still a relatively young man of 42. And he had, from the very first day, kept a written record of it. Margaret turned the page. September 2nd, 1979. Sat up all night in the kitchen looking at what I pulled out of that hole. Cannot sleep. Do not know what to do. The papers are in German, I think. Old. Some with printing that looks official. A photograph of a man in a suit I do not recognize. A list of names, most crossed out. I do not know if I should take this to the sheriff, or to Father Connor, or to no one at all. I have decided to do nothing for 7 days. I will sleep on it. I will pray on it. Then I will decide. Margaret looked at Kayla. Kayla looked back. Mom, Kayla whispered. What kind of thing has papers in German? I don't know yet, baby. But already, in some slow-turning corner of her mind, Margaret was beginning to suspect. She kept reading. Ellis had not decided, at the end of those 7 days. He had given himself another 7, and then another. And over the weeks and months and eventually years, he had sat with what he had found, and had slowly, meticulously, tried to understand it. He had driven 3 hours to the public library in Louisville and copied out phrases from the papers by hand. and taken them to a professor at the university, telling the man only that he had inherited some old documents from a German-speaking neighbor. The professor had translated fragments. The papers were, Ellis wrote, mostly inventory lists. Lists of what? I do not know. The professor said the words for silver, gold, porcelain, painting, coin. The words for a family name, Rosenfeld. The words for a city, Vienna. The words for a date, 1938. Margaret put the ledger down on her uncle's bed. Her hands had gone cold. Mom, Kayla said. Honey, Margaret said carefully. I think this gold is very old. And I think it might have belonged to someone a long time ago who lost a lot more than gold. Kayla, who was a senior taking AP European history, did not need her mother to finish the thought. Margaret could see the calculation move across her daughter's face. The city, the year, the family name, the crossed-out list. Oh, Kayla said softly. Oh, Mom. They sat together on the bed in the quiet farmhouse, and the weight of what Ellis had been carrying settled onto their shoulders for the first time. Margaret understood, now, her uncle's long silence. She understood the locked curing room. She understood the sentence, I decided a long time ago that it was not mine to spend. Ellis had not known, in 1979, how a piece of gold, or a pouch of coins, or an oilskin packet of papers, had come to be buried in the southwest corner of a Kentucky tobacco field, under an oak tree old enough to have been there since before the Civil War. He had not known who had put it there, or when, or why, but he had suspected, almost immediately, that it had come from somewhere terrible, and he had, in the gentle and careful way of a gentle and careful man, refused to pretend otherwise. Margaret kept reading. The ledger spanned decades. Most entries were short, a line a month, a line a year. Ellis had, over the course of many years, painstakingly researched what little he could research without drawing attention to himself. He wrote of driving to a synagogue in Nashville once, in 1987, and sitting in the parking lot for 2 hours before starting the car again, and driving home without going inside. I did not know how to begin. I did not know what to say. I was afraid of being mistaken, and of being right. He wrote, in 1994, of a trip to Washington, where he had visited the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and had stood in one of the rooms for nearly an hour without moving. There are lists there. I looked for the name. I did not find it. I did not know if this comforted me or did not. He wrote, in 2003, of the first time he had begun to think of Margaret. My niece Margaret. She is grown up now, and she has children of her own, and she has a harder life than she deserves. I think about what she would do with this if it were hers. I believe she would do the right thing. I believe she is the only one in this family who would. Margaret had to stop reading for a while at that one. By the final pages, which were dated only a few years before Ellis's death, the entries had grown longer. He wrote of the difficulty of finding living descendants of a family whose members had, so far as he could tell, been scattered or killed. He wrote of trying, twice, to contact organizations that specialized in Holocaust-era asset recovery, and of losing his nerve each time because he did not, he said, have enough proof, and did not want to waste anyone's time. He wrote, in the last year of his life, I am an old man now. I have run out of road. I cannot carry this anymore, and I cannot finish it. I have written a letter for Margaret. When I am gone, she will find what I found. She will know what I know, and she will decide. The final entry was dated 3 weeks before Ellis had died. I am at peace with this. She will do what is right. She has always had a good heart. I wish I had told her so more often while I was alive. Margaret closed the ledger very carefully and set it on the quilt beside her, and she put her face in her hands, and for the second time in as many days, she wept. Kayla, at 16, did something that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. She did not hug her. She did not try to soothe her. She simply sat there with her, shoulder to shoulder, and let her cry. And when Margaret was done, Kayla handed her a tissue from the box on the nightstand and said, quietly, Mom, what do we do? Margaret wiped her eyes. She looked at her daughter. She looked at the ledger. She looked through the window at the enormous barn, leaning against the morning sky. We do what Uncle Ellis would have done, baby, she said. We take our time. We do the research. We don't spend a nickel of it until we know where it came from. And if there are people out there, anywhere in the world, who lost this, we try to find them. But, Mom, Kayla said, and her voice wavered, just once, because even Kayla was still 16, what about us? What about the propane bill? What about college? What about— Margaret pulled her daughter close. Listen to me, she said. Uncle Ellis didn't say we couldn't get help out of this. He said he decided, for himself, it wasn't his to spend. That was his decision. Mine might be different, in a small way. We'll figure it out. There may be some of what's in that floor that is rightfully his by law, and so now rightfully ours. Finder's shares. Treasure trove provisions. I don't know. But first we find out what's actually down there. First we find the owners if they exist. First we do right. Then, only then, we see what's left. Kayla nodded against her shoulder. Okay. Okay, Mom. Okay. They went back out to the barn that afternoon, and this time Margaret went prepared. She brought a notebook and 2 pens. She brought a tape measure. She brought a small digital camera Kayla had saved up to buy 2 Christmases before. She brought a pair of cotton gloves from Uncle Ellis's kitchen drawer, because she had read somewhere once that you should not touch old valuable things with bare hands. She brought, above all, patience. They spent the entire afternoon carefully pulling up the boards of the cavity, one by one, numbering each board on the underside with a pencil so that they could replace them in exactly the same order. Ellis would have approved, Margaret thought. Ellis had been, in his way, a man of inventory and order. When every board was up and stacked neatly along the wall of the curing room, Margaret knelt at the edge of the cavity and looked in. She counted. It took her and Kayla the better part of 3 hours, both of them working slowly and carefully, lifting each bar out one at a time, photographing it, recording its markings in the notebook, and then setting it aside on a clean canvas tarp Margaret had spread across the floor. Margaret did not trust her own counting the first time, so they did it twice. They did it a third time just to be sure. 318 bars. 318 1-kilogram bars of fine gold, each one stamped with that same small crest and 99.99 fine and a serial number. Most carried a stamp Margaret eventually recognized from an image she'd seen online years ago, a Swiss refinery that had been operating since before the Second World War. A small number of the bars, perhaps 40, carried a different stamp, older looking, and these were the ones she found most troubling, because she knew, even without knowing anything, that these were the bars that had a history. The cloth pouches were heavier than she had expected. There were 7 of them, each one tied with leather cord that had darkened and stiffened with age. She did not open them yet. She only hefted each one, photographed it, and set it aside. The ammunition box, when she finally lifted it out of the cavity with both hands, weighed almost 20 pounds. It was olive drab green, American military surplus, stenciled on the side with faded yellow letters, Cal. 30M2. It was padlocked. Margaret had seen, among the keys Mr. Teague had given her, a small silver key she had not yet been able to identify. She tried it now. It fit. The lid of the ammunition box opened with a squeak of unused hinges. Inside, carefully wrapped in oilskin and protected from damp by little sachets of what looked like rice, were papers. Stacks and stacks of papers. Some of them plainly very old, brittle, yellowed, printed on a kind of thin paper Margaret had never seen in her own life. Some of them were Ellis's own handwritten notes, attempts at translation, sketches, cross-references. There was a manila folder with clippings from newspapers going back to the 1980s, articles about Holocaust-era art recovery, about Swiss bank dormant accounts, about looted assets. There was, finally, on the very top, a small spiral notebook in Ellis's handwriting that bore the pencil-written title for Margaret, Where to Start. Margaret's throat tightened. He had prepared a guide. Her uncle, who had carried this burden alone for 44 years, had written her a guide. She did not open the notebook yet. She could not. She and Kayla spent the remainder of the afternoon returning everything to the cavity, exactly as they had found it. Every bar went back to its place. The pouches went back in their spots. The ammunition box went back against the far wall. Margaret paused before replacing the last board and stood for a long moment looking down at what she had uncovered, and she whispered, softly enough that only Kayla could have heard, "I'll do my best, Uncle Ellis. I promise you, I'll do my very best." They replaced the floor, board by numbered board. They nailed each nail back into its original hole. They swept dust over the seams. They locked the small curing room. They locked the big barn doors. They walked back to the house together in the blue of a Kentucky twilight, And Kayla took her mother's hand like she was 6 years old again, and neither of them spoke for a long while. That night, at the kitchen table, by lamplight, Margaret finally opened the spiral notebook her uncle had left her. Margaret, he had written on the first page. If you are reading this, you have already seen what is in the floor. I will not waste your time telling you again what I think it is. You have the ledger, and you have your own good sense, and you do not need me for that part. I want to tell you, instead, what I could not finish. I want to tell you where I got stuck. And I want to tell you what I think you should do next if you choose to. First, do not take the bars to any local buyer. Do not take them to any pawn shop. Do not take them to any coin dealer in any town where our family name might be remembered. Gold bars with serial numbers can be tracked. If some of these bars were, as I suspect, taken in Europe before or during the war, they may appear on registers that track stolen assets. A dealer who sees them may notify authorities, and you may lose control of everything. And the people who deserve this, if they are still alive anywhere, may never see a penny of it. Take your time. Second, find a lawyer who specializes in what they call restitution. Not an estate lawyer, not a country lawyer. A lawyer in a big city who has worked on cases involving the Holocaust Claims Conference, or on cases involving art that was stolen from Jewish families in Europe. There will be records. There are organizations that keep them. Some of them are in New York. Some of them are in Washington. Some of them are in Jerusalem. I have written down, in the pages after this one, the names of every organization I was ever able to find. I contacted none of them directly, because I lost my nerve every time, and I am sorry for that. You will not lose your nerve. Third, do not trust anyone local. I am sorry to say that about your own family and mine, but I have lived a long time in this county, and I know what a rumor of gold does to a place. If word gets out that anything was found on this farm, there will be people who did not love me in life, but will suddenly remember being my dear cousins in death. There will be people from the county and the state, and further still, who will decide they have a claim. There will be people who say the land was really theirs, or that old Ellis had promised them something, or that the law of Kentucky entitles them to a share. Most of them will be lying. Some of them, a few, may have an honest legal claim to consider. But you must control the pace of this, not them. Keep silent until you are ready. Then speak loudly, all at once, to the right people. Fourth, I have left you some money in the safety deposit box at Farmers and Merchants, separate from what is in the barn. It is not much, about $9,000 in cash and savings bonds. It is legally yours without any question. Use it. Use it to travel. Use it to pay a lawyer's retainer. Use it to keep the lights on at the farmhouse while you do this work. Do not feel guilty about it. I saved that money honestly from my own earnings, and I saved it for you. Fifth and last, do not let this ruin you, Margaret. Do not let it own you the way it came close to owning me. I was afraid of it for too long. I grew strange because of it. I stopped seeing people because I was afraid I would say something. I want better for you than that. Do the work. Do it well. But live, too. Take your daughter on a trip. Plant a garden at this farmhouse in the spring. Laugh with your son when he comes home from the service. The gold is not the point. The gold was never the point. The point is what you do with it, and who you are when you are done. I love you. I am proud of you. I was proud of you even when you did not know I was watching. Your uncle, E.H. Margaret finished reading. She set the notebook down. She placed her hands flat on the kitchen table on either side of it, and she breathed out, slowly. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Mom, Kayla said from across the table. Baby, Margaret said. Uncle Ellis was the best man I ever knew, and I didn't know him well enough. And now I'm going to finish what he started. They drove home to Greenville the next morning, and Margaret did two things the moment they walked back into the single-wide trailer with the aluminum skirting. She wrote a check, with her last $84, for the minimum balance on the propane bill, because she wanted heat in the house for Kayla's sake while she worked. And then she sat down at the little kitchen table where, just a week earlier, she had thought her life was ending, and she opened a fresh notebook, and she began making a plan. The first step was the safety deposit box Ellis had mentioned. She drove to Owensboro 2 days later, alone, and Mr. Teague accompanied her to the bank. The box contained exactly what Ellis had said it would. $8,700 in worn bills, held together with rubber bands, and a handful of old U.S. savings bonds that, when Margaret cashed one at the bank teller's window on her way out, turned out to be worth about $300 apiece. She kept most of the bonds. She cashed one. She tucked the remaining cash into a zippered canvas pouch in her purse, and she drove home with it feeling like she was carrying a live coal. It was the most money she had held in her hand at one time in at least 5 years. That night she paid her overdue rent on the trailer, in full, in cash, and her landlord Mr. Hensley looked at her with mild surprise and said, "You come into some money, Margaret?" And Margaret smiled and said, "A little, from my uncle. He left me his farm." "A farm? Huh," Mr. Hensley said. "Worth anything?" "Tired land and a leaning barn, Mr. Hensley," Margaret said. "About what you'd expect." And she looked him right in the eye while she said it. And it was the first lie she had told in a long time. And she was surprised at how naturally it came out. And she was not, in truth, especially proud of that. She paid the hospital bill. She paid the past due electric. She put $900 into Kayla's battered savings account. She kept the rest as a careful, rationed fund for the work ahead. And in that moment, already, the weight of the last 8 months began to come off her shoulders in a way she could feel physically. Her shoulders dropped. Her jaw unclenched. She slept a full 7 hours that night for the first time since the layoff, and she woke up to her alarm instead of before it. The next step was the lawyer. Margaret spent 2 full days at the public library in Madisonville, on the library computers, because she did not have internet at the trailer and because she did not want any search history of what she was looking up to live on any device she owned. She made herself a spiral notebook list. Firms in New York that specialized in Holocaust-era restitution. Firms in Washington. Nonprofit organizations. The Holocaust Claims Conference, which her uncle had named. The Commission for Art Recovery. The World Jewish Restitution Organization. There were more of them than she had imagined there would be. There was, in fact, a whole careful, quiet industry of people whose job it was to sort out, decade after decade, what had been taken from Europe's Jews in the 1930s and 40s, and return what could be returned to the descendants of those who had survived. She settled, in the end, on a small firm in New York called Adler and Weiss, not because they were the biggest, but because their website described cases they had handled in language that sounded to Margaret like the language her Uncle Ellis would have used. Patient. Careful, honest. Margaret drafted a letter, by hand, 3 times, before finally typing it up on one of the library's public computers and printing it and mailing it, with a copy of a single photograph she had taken in the barn, to the firm's main address. The photograph showed, in tight focus, one of the older stamped gold bars, with its serial number clear and the crest visible. She did not say in the letter where the bar was. She did not say her real last name. She signed it M. Ellis and gave a rented P.O. box in Owensboro as the return address. She told them only that her elderly uncle, now deceased, had found a cache of gold bars and certain related papers buried on his property in approximately 1979, and that he had believed, on the evidence, that the cache had originated in Vienna in 1938, and that she, his heir, wished to pursue the rightful return of any portion that might be traceable to lost owners or their descendants. She wrote, at the bottom of the letter, "I am aware that I may be entitled under law to certain finder's rights for any assets that cannot be traced. I am not writing for that purpose. I am writing because I wish to do the work my uncle did not finish. Please advise." She dropped the letter in a mailbox outside the Owensboro post office, and she stood there for a long moment on the curb, her breath rising in the cold, her hands deep in the pockets of her old coat, and she thought, "All right, Uncle Ellis. We've started." 3 weeks later, an envelope arrived at the P.O. box. Inside, on very thick paper with a watermark she could feel through her fingertips, was a letter from a man named David Adler, senior partner at Adler and Weiss. The letter was 3 paragraphs long. It thanked her for her inquiry. It said that the stamp and serial range of the photograph bar was consistent with a group of bars that had been refined in Europe between 1936 and 1939, and that a small number of such bars had appeared, over the decades, on various watch lists maintained by restitution organizations. It said Mr. Adler would very much like to speak with her by telephone, at her earliest convenience, at no cost to her, and that anything she told him would be covered by attorney-client privilege from the first word spoken. At the bottom, in a slightly different ink, he had added a handwritten line. "Mrs. Ellis, whoever you are, please do not attempt to sell any portion of this cash until we have spoken. For your own sake. Margaret called him the next morning, from a pay phone outside a gas station in a town 30 miles from her own, because she was beginning, she realized, to think the way Ellis had thought for 44 years. Carefully, quietly, as if someone might be listening. David Adler had a kind voice. It was an older voice and a thoughtful one, and it made Margaret feel, within 30 seconds of hearing him say hello, that she had made the right choice. Mrs. Ellis, he said. Thank you for calling. It's Hollis, actually, Margaret said. My name is Margaret Hollis. I was being careful in the letter. I apologize. There is nothing to apologize for. Caution is a virtue in matters like this. He asked her, gently, to tell him the story from the beginning. She did. She told him about her uncle, about the letter under the saucer, about the barn, about the cavity under the floor, about the ledger and the ammunition box and the oilskin-wrapped papers, about the 318 bars she and her daughter had counted 3 times, about the 7 pouches, about her uncle's 44 years of silent care. David Adler listened without interrupting, and when she was finished, there was a long pause on the line. Mrs. Hollis, he said finally, I want to say 2 things to you. All right. The first is that what your uncle did in preserving these items intact and in maintaining a careful written record of his discovery is extraordinary. It is also, in my experience over 31 years of this work, extremely rare. Most people who stumble onto such things sell them quickly and quietly, and most of what is sold in that way disappears forever. Your uncle saved something. He saved the possibility of justice for someone. You should know that. Margaret's eyes filled. She did not trust herself to answer. The second, David Adler said, is that what you are describing, if it is what I believe it may be, has a history. I cannot be certain without examining the papers and the bars directly. But the serial range, the refinery stamp on the older bars, the Vienna connection, and the family name you mentioned, Rosenfeld, if that name appears on the crossed-out list your uncle found, those are 4 data points that line up with a case that our firm, and other firms like ours, have been aware of for many decades. A case that has not been closed. A case with living descendants, Mrs. Hollis. Do you understand what I am telling you? Yes, Margaret said. Her voice was not quite steady. Yes, sir. I think I do. I would like to fly to Kentucky next week with a colleague and examine the materials in person. We will bring a notary. We will sign a non-disclosure agreement before we examine anything, protecting your interests and those of any potential claimants. We will not remove anything from your property. We will make a written and photographic inventory, and copies of it will be sealed and placed in escrow with a neutral party, and you will retain the originals. Would this be acceptable? Margaret sat down on the concrete base of the payphone's little booth, because her legs did not feel strong enough to hold her up. Yes, sir, she said. Yes, that would be acceptable. I will also need to discuss with you, before we come, what your own role and interests in this matter may be. I can tell you, based on what you have described, that under most legal interpretations of such cases, a portion of the cash is likely to be determined to be untraceable and therefore yours by finder's right and by the ordinary operation of inheritance law. The precise portion will depend on what the papers reveal. It could be a small percentage. It could be a substantial one. I mention this now because I want you to understand, Mrs. Hollis, that doing the right thing in this case does not require you to impoverish yourself. In fact, the law anticipates that it should not. My uncle wrote something similar in his letter to me, Margaret said. Your uncle, David Adler said, sounds like he was a wise man. He was, Margaret said. He really was. They agreed on a date for the visit. Margaret gave David Adler directions to the farmhouse. She hung up the phone and stood in the gas station parking lot with her breath clouding in front of her, and she thought, for the first time in her adult life, I am in the middle of a real story. Not a small story, a real one, with real stakes, and real people, and real history. And she thought, too, I am not going to let anyone mess it up, including myself. Trouble, of course, began almost immediately, not because Margaret had done anything wrong, but because her sister Darlene was the kind of woman who noticed things. The first call came on a Tuesday evening. Margaret had just finished dinner, a simple chicken and rice that she and Kayla had eaten quietly together in the trailer, and she was washing dishes when the phone rang. Marg, Darlene said in her honey-thick telephone voice. Sugar, I was talking to Roy this morning, and he said you paid off the electric company and the hospital, and you got Kayla's school books all paid ahead for next semester. And I said, well, good for her, but where's she getting the money? And Roy said he didn't know. And I thought, well, maybe that old barn of Uncle Ellis's had something on it after all. Or maybe you got a new job you didn't tell your big sister about. Margaret's hand stilled on the dish she was drying. I got a little inheritance, Darlene, she said carefully. You know that. A little cash in a safety deposit box. 9,000, give or take. Mr. Teague told you about the estate, didn't he? He told me there were debts to the estate, and that you were the executor. He didn't tell me about any 9,000. That's a lot of money, Mark. It was Uncle Ellis's savings, Darlene. He left it to me. Uh-huh. Darlene was silent for a moment. And the barn? The house? The land? He left those to me too. You know he did. And have you had anyone out to look at the property yet? An appraiser? A real estate fella? Not yet, Margaret said. I'm going to fix it up a little first. Clean it out. It's a mess, Darlene. 40 years of an old bachelor's junk. Well, honey, when you do get it appraised, you'll let your big sister know, won't you? Uncle Ellis was our uncle, after all. I don't want a penny of what he left you personally, you know I don't. But if the estate's got hidden value, there's all sorts of things we'd all want to know about. For the family. For the records. I'll keep you in the loop, Darlene. Promise. I promise. When Margaret hung up the phone, her hand was shaking. She stood at the sink for a long moment, looking out the small kitchen window at the dark lot where her old Ford Ranger sat, and she thought, I'm going to have to get very good, very quickly, at telling people only what they need to know. The next day, her ex-husband Roy showed up at the trailer unannounced. He rarely did this anymore. He was remarried now, to a woman named Paulette who worked at a dental office in Madisonville, and he generally kept his visits with Kayla to prearranged weekends. But here he was, in his pickup truck, idling in her gravel drive at 10 in the morning on a Wednesday. Margaret opened the door, but did not step out. Roy, Mar, got a minute? Not really. I was about to run some errands. Just a minute. Won't take long. She sighed and stepped out onto the little wooden deck that served as her front porch. The cold hit her through her sweater. Roy stood at the foot of the steps with his hands in the pockets of his work jacket, and his breath clouding in front of him, and his face set in that expression he always wore when he was about to try to get something out of her. I heard you paid a bunch of bills, he said. Uncle Ellis left me a little money, Roy. I'm sure Darlene already told you. Yeah, she did. She also told me she thought there might be more than a little. Darlene thinks a lot of things. Roy shifted his weight. Marg, look. I'm not trying to stir anything up. I'm just here as Kayla's daddy. If there's some kind of windfall from this inheritance, I just want to know that some of it's going to go toward our girl's college. That's all. I'm not a skin for myself. I'm a skin for her. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Roy was not a bad man. He was not a good one, either. He was, in her long view of him, a man who was always one step behind his own decisions, always blaming the world for outcomes he had helped create. But he loved their daughter. That was one true thing she had always been able to say about him. Roy, she said carefully, if there is ever anything left from this inheritance, beyond what's already been used, Kayla will be taken care of. I promise you that. I always have, and I always will. That ain't really an answer, Mark. It's the only one I've got right now. I'm still working through the estate. There's legal stuff. There's paperwork. There's things I don't even understand yet. When there's something to tell, I'll tell you. Roy studied her. His breath came out in a long cloud. You're being awful cagey, Mark. I'm being careful, Roy. There's a difference. He nodded slowly. Then, unexpectedly, he said, I hope it's a lot. I do. Whatever it is. I hope Uncle Ellis left you something good. Lord knows you've earned it. And I'm sorry for the way the last few months have been on you. Margaret did not know what to say to that. It was the closest thing to an apology Roy had ever given her, for any of it, and she did not know if she wanted to accept it or slam the door. She compromised by saying only, Thanks, Roy. That means something. He tipped his hat to her, and he got back in his truck, and he drove away, and Margaret stood on the porch for a long minute after he was gone, and she thought, Darlene told him. Darlene is going to tell everyone. I have to get in front of this. That night, she called Mr. Teague, the lawyer. Mr. Teague, she said, I want to ask you something that might sound a little paranoid. Go ahead, Mrs. Hollis. If someone, a family member, say, were to try to contest my uncle's estate, to try to argue that I wasn't entitled to what he left me, how strong is my position? Mr. Teague chuckled softly. Your position is about as strong as a position can be, Mrs. Hollis. Your uncle's written instructions were very specific and very clear. The property was his, free and clear, with no mortgage and no liens. He named you as sole heir in a document witnessed by 2 reputable parties and notarized by a notary in good standing. Short of proving him mentally incompetent at the time he wrote those instructions, which would be nearly impossible given the lucidity of the documents themselves, no family member has any legal standing to contest the estate. May I ask what's prompting this? My sister, Margaret said. Ah, Mr. Teague said. Yes, I had a feeling, from the one phone call I received from her, that she might take an interest. Mr. Teague, did she call you? She did. Last Friday. I told her nothing beyond what is already a matter of public record at the probate office. I will continue to do so. Your privacy, Mrs. Hollis, is well within my ability to protect, and I intend to protect it. Margaret closed her eyes. Thank you. You are welcome. And Mrs. Hollis, if I may, if you are dealing with something that is larger than an ordinary estate matter, and I will not ask you whether you are, I would suggest retaining formal counsel in addition to our firm's ordinary probate services. Someone in a larger city. Someone accustomed to handling complicated matters in which family members may have opinions. I have, Margaret said. A firm in New York. There was a small silence. Well, Mr. Teague said. Good for you, Mrs. Hollis. Good for you. I will confess that raises rather more questions than it answers, but I will not ask them. I will simply wish you luck. Thank you, Mr. Teague. You are a careful woman, Mrs. Hollis. Your uncle was not wrong about you. Margaret hung up and sat for a long time in the quiet kitchen with her hand on the receiver, and she thought, he knew. He knew something was unusual all along. He was just waiting for me to get there on my own. David Adler flew into Louisville the following Thursday with his colleague, a younger attorney named Rachel Weinstein, who specialized, Adler explained, in the authentication of physical assets in restitution cases. They rented a car and drove the 3 hours to the farmhouse, and Margaret met them at the top of the dirt lane at noon, dressed in her best jeans and a clean flannel shirt and her heavy work coat, standing beside her old Ranger with Kayla at her side, because Margaret had decided, after much thought, that her daughter should be present for this. Kayla was part of this. Kayla had knelt beside her in the curing room. Kayla had counted the bars with her. Kayla had earned the right to see what came next. David Adler was a tall, thin man in his 60s, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and round gold-rimmed glasses and an overcoat that looked like it cost more than Margaret's truck. Rachel Weinstein was a woman in her early 40s, compact and sharp-eyed, with her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail and a leather satchel slung over one shoulder. Both of them shook Margaret's hand with a formality Margaret found steadying, and David Adler bent slightly at the waist to shake Kayla's hand too, and he said, Miss Hollis, I have been looking forward to meeting you. Your mother spoke very highly of you. Kayla, to Margaret's pride, met his eyes and said, Thank you, sir. I'm glad you came. They went into the farmhouse first. Margaret made coffee. They sat at Uncle Ellis's kitchen table, and the 2 attorneys produced from their briefcases an absurd-seeming stack of paper, a non-disclosure agreement, an engagement letter, a fee agreement explicitly capping Margaret's eventual financial exposure at a fixed amount regardless of the complexity of the case, a confidentiality agreement between Margaret and the firm, and a third-party escrow service. They explained each document, line by line. Margaret read them. She asked questions. Kayla, who had been absorbing the language of the legal world for 3 weeks now through her own research at the Madisonville Library, asked a few questions of her own that made David Adler smile in quiet approval. Finally, Margaret signed. And so did they. Then they walked out to the barn. Margaret unlocked the big doors. She unlocked the small curing room. She showed them the scored board, 3 in from the door, in the corner nearest the east wall, and she handed David Adler her uncle's pry bar and said, very quietly, Please. He took the pry bar. But before he used it, he paused. He looked down at the floor. He looked up at the dark planks of the small room that had held this secret for 44 years. He looked at Margaret. Mrs. Hollis, he said, before I do this, I want to say, for the record, that what I am about to see is, in all likelihood, the largest intact, untouched cache of its type that has ever come to my firm's attention. I have been in this work for more than 30 years. I have seen single items. I have seen small boxes. I have never, in my career, seen what you are about to show me. Do you understand the gravity of that? I'm starting to, Margaret said. And I want you to know, David Adler said, that from this moment forward, everything we do is for the record, and the record will, I believe, one day be a small part of history. Your name, and your uncle's name, and your daughter's name, will be in it, and they will be in it with honor. Are you ready? Margaret looked at Kayla. Kayla, in her second-hand parka, with her glasses slightly fogged from the cold, looked back at her mother and gave a single, small, determined nod. Yes, Margaret said. We're ready. David Adler knelt on the cold plank floor in his expensive overcoat, and he set the pry bar under the end of the scored board, and he leaned on it, and the board came up with the same long, dry, reluctant groan it had made the first time, and then, board by numbered board, together, the four of them opened the floor of that old tobacco barn to the light of day for only the second time since Ellis Hollis had sealed it up so many years before. Rachel Weinstein took out her camera. She began to photograph. She did not speak for a very long time, and when she finally did, it was to turn to David Adler, with her face carefully professional but her eyes unmistakably bright, and to say, David, these are the Rosenfeld bars. Or at least, some of them are. The older stamped ones. I'd stake my career on it. David Adler did not answer at first. He looked down into the cavity for a long, long moment. He removed his gold-rimmed glasses. He polished them with a handkerchief from his overcoat pocket. He put them back on. Then he turned to Margaret, and he said, very quietly, Mrs. Hollis, I think we should have a long conversation tonight, at your kitchen table, about what happens next. There are living descendants. I believe I may already know two of them by name. This case is going to change many things, including, if you allow me to be frank, your life. I want to make sure you are ready for that. Margaret reached out and found Kayla's hand. Kayla's hand gripped hers back, hard. I'm ready, Mr. Adler, Margaret said. My daughter and I are ready. And outside the barn, beyond its leaning dark walls, the Kentucky wind moved through the dead stalks of the tobacco field, and somewhere a crow called once, and the afternoon light slanted low and golden across the 17 tired acres of Uncle Ellis's old farm. And for the first time in her adult life, Margaret Hollis understood that the story she was inside of was not going to end in defeat. It was going to end in something else entirely. And it was going to take her and her daughter and her quiet dead uncle all the way through it, together. They sat at Uncle Ellis's kitchen table until nearly midnight that first evening. The wood stove ticked and sighed in its metal skin. Outside the small farmhouse, the wind had risen, and the old windows in their wooden frames gave off the quiet, rhythmic complaints of a house that had learned, over many decades, to breathe along with the weather. Margaret had put on a fresh pot of coffee. Kayla had set out the cheap ceramic mugs from the cupboard, the ones with the brown stripes around the rims that had been there since before Margaret was born. David Adler had removed his overcoat and draped it over the back of his chair, and in his shirt sleeves, with his tie loosened and his gold-rimmed glasses pushed up onto his forehead, he looked less like a New York attorney and more like the tired, thoughtful, old uncle in a family Margaret did not have. Rachel Weinstein had her laptop open on the table. Its blue glow lit her face from below and gave her a serious, almost monastic air as she scrolled through what Margaret could see were catalog entries, old photographs, and rows of numbers. Mrs. Hollis, David Adler said, I want to tell you what we believe, and I want to tell you what we do not yet know, and I want to be careful, tonight, not to confuse the two. Please, Margaret said. What we believe, he said, is this. In 1938, in Vienna, a family named Rosenfeld was forced, along with many thousands of other Jewish families, to surrender or abandon nearly the whole of what they owned. The Rosenfelds were not the wealthiest family in Vienna, but they were comfortable. The father, Isaac Rosenfeld, was a dealer in precious metals. He ran a small firm that, among other things, acquired refined gold bars from Swiss refineries for resale to jewelers and private clients across Central Europe. When the Nazis annexed Austria in March of 1938 in what is called the Anschluss, the Rosenfeld family was subjected to what historians now call the Aryanization of Jewish businesses. In plain language, Mrs. Hollis, they were robbed by the state. Margaret set her coffee down. Kayla, beside her, had gone very still. Most of what was taken from the Rosenfelds, Adler continued, was confiscated, melted down, catalogued, or sold to buyers across occupied Europe. A great deal of it simply vanished. But there is a record, held in archives now in Israel, and in Vienna and in the United States, that in the late summer of 1938, Isaac Rosenfeld, who had some foresight and some friends still willing to help, managed to remove from his firm's vaults a portion of his inventory before the confiscation was finalized. A specific portion, approximately 341 kilogram bars of fine gold, of which a subset, perhaps 40 to 50, carried a distinctive older stamp from a Swiss refinery that had been one of his family's preferred suppliers since before the First World War. There were also coins, older coins, some of them quite valuable, from his personal collection. And there were papers, business papers, inventory lists, photographs, correspondence, and a list, Mrs. Hollis, of names. Names of associates, of family, of friends. A list that was maintained, we believe, as a kind of address book for a man who feared he might be separated from his community for a long time. Margaret thought of the list of names in the oilskin packet. The crossed-out names. What happened to the family? She asked. David Adler was quiet for a moment. Isaac Rosenfeld was arrested in November of 1938 in the aftermath of Kristallnacht. He died in Dachau in February of 1939. His wife, Miriam, and their 3 children were able to leave Austria in April of 1939 with the assistance of relatives in the United States, a cousin branch of the family that had emigrated to New York around the turn of the century. Miriam brought her children to the United States in the summer of 1939. She never spoke publicly of what she and her husband had done in the months before his arrest, but family lore, Mrs. Hollis, has long held that Isaac arranged, through an intermediary whose name was never recorded, for a portion of his inventory to be shipped to the United States ahead of the family, with instructions to hold it until the family was reunited. The family was never reunited, Margaret said softly. No, David Adler said. The family was never reunited. Isaac was dead, and the shipment, whatever it was, never reached Miriam. She and her children rebuilt their lives in New York. The 3 children grew up. They had their own children. They had their own grandchildren. Some of them went into business, some into medicine, one into music. But the story of their grandfather Isaac's final act of foresight, was passed down in the family as a kind of wound that had never healed. The children and grandchildren of Miriam Rosenfeld have known, for 3 generations now, that somewhere in the world, their family's gold, and their grandfather's papers, might still exist. They have never known where. They have never known if. They have learned, painfully, over many decades, to accept that they probably never would. Rachel Weinstein, quiet until now, turned her laptop to face Margaret. On the screen was a black and white photograph. A solid, handsome man with a wide mustache and kind eyes, standing in what looked like a small office, his hand resting on a wooden desk. This is Isaac Rosenfeld, Rachel said. The photograph was taken in Vienna in 1936. The firm's records, what survived of them, show that at the time of the confiscation, his inventory included a number of bars bearing a specific older stamp from a refinery called Arger. That stamp, Mrs. Hollis, is the stamp on approximately 40 of the bars that you showed us this afternoon. The others, the more recent stamped bars, would be consistent with ordinary business inventory acquired in the late 1930s. The cash matches the documentary record almost exactly. And the papers, Mrs. Hollis, the papers in the ammunition box. I have only glanced at them, but one of them appears to be a letter, in Isaac Rosenfeld's hand, addressed to his wife. If that letter is authentic, and if it says what I believe such a letter would say, then we are not speaking of a probability. We are speaking of a certainty. Margaret looked at the kind-eyed man in the photograph for a long time. What do you think happened to it all, after Isaac died? She asked quietly. We do not know, David Adler said. We probably will never know with full certainty. The intermediary who took the cash out of Vienna must have carried it through Europe somehow, perhaps into France, perhaps into Switzerland, and from there, at some point, to the United States. Somewhere along that journey, the intermediary either died, or was killed, or lost his nerve, or chose, perhaps out of fear, to bury what he was carrying in a place where he believed no one would find it. Kentucky, Mrs. Hollis, is not as strange a final resting place for such a cache as you might think. In the late 1930s and 1940s, there were small German-speaking communities scattered across rural America, including in several counties in Kentucky. Some of the men who traveled through these communities in those years were, among other things, people fleeing Europe by whatever irregular routes they could find. The burial of valuables in rural fields was not uncommon. What is uncommon is that one of those burials should eventually be found, and found by a man who refused to profit from it, and refused to destroy it, and refused to let it disappear. He paused. He looked around the small kitchen, at the wood stove, at the old calendar still on the wall from the year before Ellis had died, at Kayla in her second-hand parka and Margaret in her worn flannel shirt. "Your uncle, Mrs. Hollis," David Adler said, "kept something safe that a great many very powerful people, over many decades, spent their professional lives searching for. He did it from a leaning barn at the end of a dirt road. He did it, by every indication, without ever telling another living soul. And at the end of his life, he entrusted it to the one person in his family he believed would do the right thing. I have been in this work for 31 years, Mrs. Hollis. I do not often say this, but I would very much have liked to know your uncle." Margaret was not sure when she had started crying, but Kayla was pressed against her side, and David Adler had turned slightly away out of quiet courtesy, and Rachel Weinstein was looking at her laptop screen with more concentration than it required, and Margaret let herself cry without apology, because there was no shame in crying for a man who had done such a thing and died alone. The weeks that followed did not belong, Margaret came to realize, to her ordinary life. They belonged to a different life altogether, one she was being gently and steadily ushered into by David Adler and his firm, and she accepted the transfer with both hands because she understood, now, that she was not equipped to do this on her own. Within 10 days of that first visit, the entire contents of the cavity were removed from the barn under the supervision of Adler and Weiss, transported in an armored vehicle hired by the firm, and placed in a climate-controlled private vault in Louisville that was, Margaret was told, one of only a small number of facilities in the region rated for the secure storage of high-value precious metals. The transfer was handled quietly. A private security detail was engaged, not to announce a great presence, but to ensure that nothing went wrong. Margaret drove behind the armored vehicle in her own truck, with Kayla beside her, and she watched the heavy doors of that vault close on the 318 bars, and the 7 pouches, and the green ammunition box of papers, and she thought, "Goodbye for now, Uncle Ellis's burden. May the right people find you soon." The authentication and appraisal took place over the course of the following 2 months. Rachel Weinstein flew down twice more. A specialist from a European refinery was consulted by telephone. The older stamped bars were confirmed by a combination of serial number cross-reference, metallurgical analysis, and physical examination, as bars refined at the Arger refinery between 1929 and 1938, and consistent with the inventory records of the Rosenfeld firm as reconstructed from archive documents held in Vienna and Jerusalem. The newer stamped bars, those without direct provenance, were appraised as ordinary fine gold of the same period, almost certainly acquired by Isaac Rosenfeld's firm as ordinary business inventory, but lacking the specific documentation needed to tie them to a named original owner. The coins in the 7 pouches turned out to be, in the words of a numismatic specialist hired by Adler and Weiss, an extraordinary collection of pre-war European gold coinage, heavy on Austrian and German issue, but including rare pieces from Italy, France, and the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. Many of them, Rachel told Margaret on the telephone one evening, had been photographed and catalogued in the Rosenfeld family's own pre-war records, which still existed in the archives of an Israeli research institute. The papers in the ammunition box, when finally examined in full, turned out to include all of the things David Adler had suspected and several he had not. The list of names, with its careful crossings out, was indeed a family address book of the kind Isaac Rosenfeld had maintained for his business. Many of those names, when researched, turned out to belong to people who had died in the camps, or in flight, or in the long quiet tragedy of a continent at war, and the crossing outs had been done, Rachel told Margaret, by the intermediary himself as he learned, month by month from his sources, who had perished. The letter in Isaac's own hand, addressed to his wife, was authenticated by handwriting analysts against samples held in the Jerusalem archive, and it read, in part, "Miriam, my beloved, if this letter ever reaches you, then whatever I have sent with it has also reached you, and it will provide for you and our children until I can find you again. If it does not reach you, I hope that whoever finds it will understand that what he has come upon does not belong to him, and that he will act accordingly. I trust in the decency of strangers, because my own people have been betrayed by their neighbors, and I have nothing left but that trust." Margaret read the English translation of Isaac Rosenfeld's letter at her kitchen table on a Saturday morning, while Kayla looked over her shoulder, and when she had finished reading, she placed her hands flat on the table on either side of the page, and she said, out loud, to the empty kitchen, "Uncle Ellis, you were the stranger, and you were decent. You were so decent." Kayla, quiet beside her, said, "Mom, we have to find them. We have to find Isaac's grandchildren. They need to know. Mr. Adler is already finding them, baby. That's happening right now. I know. I want to be there when it happens. When they know, can we be there?" Margaret looked at her daughter. Her serious, glasses-wearing, notebook-carrying daughter, who at 16 had already understood more about the weight of history than many adults Margaret had known in her lifetime. "Yes, baby," she said. "If they want us there, we'll be there." The total, in the end, was larger than anything Margaret had allowed herself to imagine. David Adler sat at her kitchen table on a cold afternoon in January, nearly 3 months after that first visit, with a single sheet of paper in front of him that bore the firm's letterhead and a short typed summary of the appraised valuations. "Mrs. Hollis," he said, "I would like to go through these numbers with you, and I want you to take them slowly, because they are the kind of numbers that can frighten a person even when they are happy numbers. Are you all right?" "Yes, Mr. Adler." "The gold bars," he said, 318 of them at 1 kilogram each, at current market value for fine gold, are valued at approximately $21,500,000 as simple commodity. That is, if you were to melt them down tomorrow, that is what you would receive." Margaret nodded slowly. "However," David Adler said, "these bars are not ordinary commodity. A subset of them, the approximately 40 bars bearing the older Arger stamp, are bars with documented provenance, which places them in a very particular and very specific market. Bars of that provenance, restored to the Rosenfeld family or their designated trust, would not be sold as commodity. They would be sold, or retained, as historical artifacts, with premiums that, in previous comparable cases, have ranged from 2 to 4 times their commodity value. Our firm's conservative estimate for the total restitution value of the cash, accounting for the older bars at their historical premium, the coin collection at its numismatic value, and certain documentary materials at their archival value, is in the range of $318 million. Margaret did not react for a long moment. She only sat, with her hands folded in her lap, and looked at the paper. "Mr. Adler," she said quietly, "can you say that number again, please?" $318 million, David Adler said gently. "Give or take several million in either direction, depending on how the papers and the older bars are finally valued. It is, Mrs. Hollis, a very large number." Margaret laughed. It came out of her unexpectedly, a short surprised laugh, more breath than sound. "Mr. Adler," she said, 3 months ago I had $68.42 in my checking account and an eviction notice on my kitchen table." "I know, Mrs. Hollis. $318 million. Yes. Mr. Adler." She paused. She looked at him steadily across the table. "Most of that is not mine. I understand that. You understand that I understand that. I just want to say it out loud." David Adler nodded slowly. "I do understand that you understand that. And I want to tell you, Mrs. Hollis, that in the nearly 60 clients I have represented over the past 3 decades in cases of this kind, in which a holder of unclaimed Holocaust-era assets has the legal ability to attempt to retain a large portion of those assets, you are now the 4th person who has said those words to me in this way. 4. In 31 years. Most clients fight us on every inch. Most clients instruct us to pursue only the narrowest legal definition of traceability and to retain everything that cannot be tied, through airtight documentation, to a named pre-war owner. You are not doing that. I want you to know that I notice. I want you to know that I respect you for it. And I want to tell you that even under the broadest interpretation of restitution that this case will permit, there will still be a significant portion that will be legally, clearly, and unambiguously yours. Tell me, Margaret said. The approximately 270 bars without documented provenance, David Adler said. The newer stamped ones cannot, by the standards of our profession, be tied to any specific pre-war owner. They were almost certainly Isaac Rosenfeld's business inventory, but in the absence of specific serial number matching to a documented inventory list, which does not exist for these bars, they cannot, in law, be restored to the family on that basis alone. They are, in the clearest possible legal sense, treasure trove. They were found on your property, which you own outright and inherited legally. They will, by almost any reading of the relevant state and federal law, be yours, subject to ordinary tax obligations. 270 bars. At current commodity value, Mrs. Hollis, approximately $18,300,000. Margaret sat very still. Mrs. Hollis, David Adler said, I want to say one more thing, because I want you to hear it from someone who has no reason to say it to you except that it is true. Yes, if you had wished to, from the first day, you could have taken that entire cash to the nearest unscrupulous dealer, accepted 40 cents on the dollar for commodity gold, no questions asked, and been a woman with $9 million by the end of the month. Some people would have done that. You did not. You wrote a letter to a firm in New York because your uncle asked you to do the right thing, and you agreed to do it. You will now receive, for doing the right thing, a sum of money that will change your life and your children's lives and your grandchildren's lives entirely. I want you to feel no complication in receiving it, Mrs. Hollis. It is not a reward for virtue. It is, legally and morally, the ordinary operation of the law, which anticipates and protects the rights of honest finders. Your uncle understood this. I suspect he would be very glad. Margaret nodded. Her eyes were wet. She did not, for once, mind. $18,300,000, she said aloud, because the number did not, at first, feel like a real number. Yes, Mrs. Hollis. For a carpenter from Greenville, Kentucky, whose sister told her 6 weeks ago to set a match to the barn. David Adler allowed himself, for the first time Margaret had seen, a small, tired, genuinely warm smile. For that carpenter, Mrs. Hollis, he said. Exactly for that one. The meeting with the Rosenfeld descendants took place 6 weeks later, on a Thursday in early March, in a conference room on the 38th floor of a glass building in Midtown Manhattan. Margaret had never been to New York City in her life. She had never flown on a commercial airplane. She had never, before that week, owned a coat appropriate for an office in the middle of a New York winter, and David Adler's firm had very graciously, very quietly, arranged for one to be delivered to her hotel room, along with a pair of simple leather shoes, a set of simple clothes, and a handwritten note from David Adler himself that read, Mrs. Hollis, please accept these without hesitation. They are, in the context of this case, a legitimate business expense. You will need to walk into this meeting as yourself, and yourself deserves to be comfortable and warm. D.A. Margaret had read the note twice, and then she had laughed, and then she had tried on the coat, and then she had cried again, because the woman she had been in November of the previous year would never have believed that the woman she was in March of the following year would be standing in a Manhattan hotel room looking at herself in a proper mirror, in a proper coat, about to meet the grandchildren of a man murdered in Dachau in 1939 to tell them that what their grandfather had sent to save them had finally, after 87 years, arrived. Kayla had come with her, of course. Kayla wore a navy blue dress that she had bought on sale at a department store in Owensboro the week before the trip, and she had done her own hair, and she had her small notebook with her, because Kayla took her small notebook everywhere still. Margaret wore a simple gray blouse and a simple gray skirt, and the coat David Adler had sent, and the shoes he had sent, and in the elevator going up to the 38th floor, she took her daughter's hand and held it very tightly, and she whispered, Baby, whatever happens in there, I am so proud of you for being here. I'm proud of you too, Mom, Kayla said. The elevator doors opened onto a long hallway of polished stone floors and soft lighting. David Adler was waiting for them at the end of it, his gold-rimmed glasses catching the light, his overcoat gone now, his expression grave and kind, and, Margaret thought, a little proud. He said, quietly, Mrs. Hollis, Miss Hollis, thank you for coming. They are waiting for us. How many of them? Margaret asked. 7, David Adler said. All of the living grandchildren of Miriam Rosenfeld, and 2 of the great-grandchildren who specifically asked to be present. The eldest is a woman named Hannah Rosenfeld Stern, who is 73. She is the granddaughter of Isaac and Miriam. She has been the informal keeper of the family's history for many decades. I have spoken with her on the telephone 3 times, Mrs. Hollis. She is, I think, about to become very important to you. He led them down the hall. He paused at the door of the conference room. He looked at Margaret for a moment. Mrs. Hollis, he said, take your time. There is no script. Say what is true. They will understand. He opened the door. The room beyond was long and bright, with a wall of glass overlooking Midtown Manhattan under a hard, bright March sky. At the long wooden table sat 7 people, 6 women and 1 man. 3 of them were elderly. 2 were middle-aged. 2 were in their 30s. They rose, all 7 of them, as Margaret walked in. They did not speak. They only stood and looked at her, and at Kayla behind her, and the room was very quiet for what felt like a long time. The eldest of them, a small, compact, silver-haired woman in a dark dress, stepped forward. She had the face of someone who had spent a lifetime looking carefully at other faces and learning to read them. Her eyes, behind round glasses not unlike David Adler's, were extraordinarily blue. Mrs. Hollis, she said softly. Her voice was accented, just barely, with something of Europe, the faint echo of a mother and grandmother who had spoken German in the kitchen of a Brooklyn walk-up 80 years ago. My name is Hannah Rosenfeld Stern. I am Isaac's granddaughter. I am, I suppose, the head of this small family that remains. I'm Margaret Hollis, ma'am, Margaret said. This is my daughter, Kayla. May I? Hannah said. May I shake your hand? Please. Hannah Rosenfeld Stern took Margaret's hand in both of hers. Her hands were small and cool. She held Margaret's hand for a long moment without saying anything. She did not shake it. She simply held it, as if she were trying to learn something from the feel of it. Then she let go, and she stepped back, and she said, simply, thank you. Margaret opened her mouth to respond and could not. Hannah did not seem to mind. She turned, instead, to Kayla. She smiled. It was a small, warm, intelligent smile, and it transformed her face, and Kayla, who was so rarely shy, actually lowered her eyes for a moment. And you, my dear, Hannah said. You are the granddaughter. I'm the daughter, ma'am, Kayla said. Yes, of course. Forgive me. It is strange, at my age, to meet young women. I forget sometimes what the word granddaughter means to other people. To me, it means someone very old, because that is what I am. Come, sit. All of you. There are so many things to say, and I do not think any of us is ready to say them yet, but we will try. They sat. The 7 Rosenfeld descendants, and Margaret, and Kayla, and David Adler, and Rachel Weinstein, who had come up the elevator separately, arranged themselves around the long table. A pitcher of water sat at the center. Nobody reached for it. Hannah Rosenfeld Stern opened a leather folio on the table in front of her. From it, she withdrew a single photograph. She slid it across the table to Margaret. It was the same photograph Rachel Weinstein had shown Margaret in the kitchen in Kentucky that first night. Isaac Rosenfeld, in his small office in Vienna in 1936, with his hand on a wooden desk and his kind, wide-mustached face caught mid-smile. This is my grandfather, Hannah said. I never met him, Mrs. Hollis. He was murdered when my mother was 9 years old. My mother came to America on a ship with her mother, my grandmother Miriam, and her 2 brothers, and they had nothing. Nothing, Mrs. Hollis, except the clothes they were wearing and the certainty that their father and their husband was dead. My grandmother worked as a seamstress in New York for the rest of her life. My mother cleaned houses to put herself through school. My uncle served in the United States Army in the Pacific. We did not, as a family, become rich. We did not become poor. We were what people become when their world is taken from them, and they have to build another one from scratch with their hands. We became American. She paused. She looked down at the photograph. My grandmother, she said, told us about the gold, Mrs. Hollis. She told us about it on her deathbed in 1976. She said, Hannah, somewhere in the world, your grandfather sent gold for us. He told me, in the last letter I ever received from him, that he had arranged it. He said a man would come. No man ever came. But it is out there, child. Somewhere it is out there. Do not chase it. It will find you, or it will not, and either way you must live your life. And we lived our lives, Mrs. Hollis. All of us, all of this family, lived our lives without the gold. We lived our lives believing, mostly, that it was gone forever, taken by whoever had been entrusted with it, and who had proved unworthy of that trust. Some of us lived our lives quite angry about it. Some of us made a kind of peace with it. All of us, I think, stopped expecting, some years ago, that we would ever know what had become of it. She looked up. And then Mr. Adler called me in January, she said. And he told me about a woman in Kentucky. Margaret could not speak. Mrs. Hollis, Hannah said, I want you to understand something. I cannot speak for all of my cousins. We are, as you see, a small family, and like any family, we do not always agree. But I want to tell you, personally, on behalf of myself and of the grandmother and mother I loved, that what your uncle did, and what you have done, is the most remarkable thing that has happened to our family in my lifetime. You returned to us what we had long ago stopped believing could be returned. You did so without being asked. You did so without being compelled. You did so at significant personal cost, and at significant personal risk, and according to Mr. Adler, you have been nothing but gracious and patient throughout a process that, I am told, can be very trying. I do not know how to say thank you for this, Mrs. Hollis. I genuinely do not know. I came into this room without a prepared speech, because no words I prepared felt honest enough. I am trying to speak honestly now. I hope I am succeeding. Mrs. Stern, Margaret said, and her voice was not steady, you are succeeding. Please. Hannah reached across the table. She took Margaret's hand again. And this time, after a moment, she reached her other hand out toward Kayla, and Kayla gave hers to her. And Hannah Rosenfeld Stern held the hands of both Margaret and Kayla Hollis across the polished wood of that conference table in Manhattan, and she cried, for the first time, openly and without apology, for her grandfather whom she had never met, and for her grandmother who had died believing the gold was gone forever, and for the quiet tobacco farmer in Kentucky who had carried her family's secret, unasked, for 44 years. Around the table, one by one, the other descendants reached forward. They placed their hands on top of hers, and on top of Margaret's, and on top of Kayla's, and for a long moment the whole table was bound in a single stack of hands, 3 generations of 2 families that had never known each other but were now, by the long and patient and improbable threads of history, finally joined. Kayla, 16 years old, with her glasses slipping down her nose, was openly crying too, and she did not try to hide it, and she did not try to apologize for it. And Margaret was so proud of her daughter in that moment that she thought her chest might come apart. The meeting went on for hours. There were practical discussions. There were legal frameworks to explain. There were decisions, collectively made, about how the restored assets would be distributed, whether they would be sold, retained, or placed into a trust that would fund educational and historical purposes in the name of Isaac and Miriam Rosenfeld. There were exchanges of family stories. The Rosenfeld cousins wanted to know about Uncle Ellis. Margaret told them what she knew, and she read to them, with David Adler's translation help, a passage from Ellis's ledger about the day in 1994 when he had stood in a room of the Holocaust Memorial Museum for an hour without moving, looking for a name. When Margaret read those words aloud, Hannah Rosenfeld Stern put her face in her hands and wept again, because she had been in that same museum many times herself. And to think of the quiet Kentucky farmer who had traveled all that way alone to look for her family's name was, she said, almost more than she could bear. Before Margaret and Kayla left the building, one of the younger Rosenfeld descendants, a woman in her 30s named Rebecca who worked, she said, as a professor of European history at a university in Philadelphia, pulled Margaret aside in the hallway outside the elevator. Mrs. Hollis, Rebecca said, I wanted to tell you one thing in private, if that's all right. Of course. When Mr. Adler called my grandmother Hannah in January and told her about this, she called me that same night. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. She said, Becca, the gold. They found the gold. And then she said something I have been thinking about for 2 months. She said, a stranger found it, Becca. A stranger took care of it for us. This is what Isaac wrote. He trusted in the decency of strangers. And the stranger was decent. Rebecca paused. She looked at Margaret steadily. Mrs. Hollis, she said, you and your uncle. You proved my great-grandfather right. After everything. After the camps. After the loss. After the decades. You proved him right about human beings. I want you to know that, because I don't think anyone else will ever say it to you quite that plainly, and I think you should hear it. My family did not get our grandfather back. But we got, from you, the last thing he ever believed in, restored to us. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Margaret hugged her. She did not plan to. She simply did. And Rebecca, for a long quiet moment, hugged her back. Margaret did not tell her sister about the money until April. She flew home from New York with Kayla, and for the first 2 weeks after their return, she said nothing to anyone in Greenville. She paid a few more bills. She kept her life almost exactly as it had been. She went to the grocery store and bought the same things she always bought. She drove the same old Ranger. She wore the same old coats. She did not tell Kayla's father, or her own mother's few remaining friends, or the ladies at the small Baptist church she attended irregularly, or the neighbors in the trailer park. She did not tell anyone, because she had learned, over the quiet weeks with David Adler, that telling things is a thing you only get to do once, and that the order in which you tell them matters. The first person she told outside the immediate circle of the case was her son, Daniel, by a long phone call to his base overseas. Daniel was 23 years old. He had enlisted at 19, partly out of a sense of duty and partly because he had understood, even at 19, that his mother could not afford to send him to college the way other boys' mothers could. He served as a mechanic, a careful, thoughtful young man who had always been the quietest person at any family gathering, and Margaret had worried about him every day since he had shipped out. When she finally got him on the line, she told him first that she loved him, and then she told him that she was proud of him, and then, very slowly, she told him what had happened since Uncle Ellis's letter had arrived under the chipped saucer on her kitchen counter. She told him about the barn. She told him about the cavity. She told him about the ledger. She told him about Isaac Rosenfeld. She told him about the meeting in Manhattan. She told him, finally, about the number. Daniel did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, in his slow, quiet way, "Mama, I'd like to come home. I want you to come home, baby. Not for long. Just to sit in that farmhouse kitchen with you and Kayla for a few days. And to see the barn. And to meet Mr. Teague. And just to, I don't know, just to be where Uncle Ellis was. I didn't know. Him, Mama. I want to understand him a little before I go back to my unit. Daniel, baby, you come home whenever they'll let you." "Mama." Daniel paused. "Mama, I'm really proud of you. For what you did. For how you did it. I didn't know you were in all of this alone for so long, and I'm sorry I wasn't there." Margaret had to sit down. "Oh, honey, you were exactly where you were supposed to be." The second person she told was her ex-husband, Roy. She told him at the trailer, over coffee, without Kayla present. Roy listened without interrupting. His face went through several expressions, but none of them, Margaret was relieved to see, was the one she had most feared, which was calculation. When she had finished, Roy set down his coffee and looked at her for a long moment. "Margaret," he said, "can I say something, and not have it taken the wrong way?" "Go ahead. That's the most I've ever respected you." She had not expected that. She did not know what to say. "I'm serious," Roy said. "A lot of people, Marg, would have grabbed that gold and run. A lot of people would have lied about it. I'm not saying I would have. I'm not saying I wouldn't have. I'm saying you didn't. And I want to tell you that whatever else I said to you over the years, whatever else we were to each other, good and bad, I'm real glad you're Kayla's mama. And I'm real glad Danny grew up with you raising him. That's all I wanted to say." Margaret, for the first time in more than 20 years, did not know how to respond to her ex-husband. She finally said, "Thank you, Roy. Will some of it be for the kids? All of it that matters will be for the kids, Roy. Kayla's college. Daniel's future. I'm setting up trusts for them." "That's good, Mark. That's what I was hoping to hear." "And Roy, I'm not going to ask you for anything back. Anything. No repayment of the years of thin child support. Nothing. You don't owe me a cent from here on out. We're square." Roy looked down at his hands. "That's generous of you." "It's just accurate," Margaret said. "I'm fine now. Kayla's fine. Daniel's going to be fine. Let's just be on good terms going forward and raise our daughter together for one more year until she's off to school." "Deal, Mar, deal." The third person she told was her sister Darlene. She drove to Bowling Green for that one. She parked in Darlene's wide driveway, and she walked up onto Darlene's wide front porch, and she rang Darlene's doorbell, And when Darlene opened the door with a smile that was already too bright and said, "Well, stranger, what brings you to the big city?" Margaret said, "Darl, we need to talk. Can I come in?" They sat in Darlene's immaculate kitchen with its granite countertops and its stainless steel refrigerator and its many, many small decorative signs about living, laughing, and loving. Darlene poured them each a glass of iced tea. She sat across the table from Margaret with her hands folded, and Margaret could absolutely see, Darlene's mind racing through possibilities for what Margaret was about to say. Margaret told her. She told her more than she had told Roy, actually, because Darlene was her sister and had known Uncle Ellis growing up too, and Margaret felt, in her strange new life, that Darlene deserved the fuller version. She told her about the letter under the saucer. She told her about the cavity under the curing room floor. She told her about Isaac Rosenfeld. She told her about the Rosenfeld descendants. She told her about the meeting in Manhattan. And she told her, finally, about the number. Darlene's reaction was, Margaret thought, the most honest thing Darlene had ever shown her in their entire adult lives. First, Darlene went very pale. Then her eyes filled. Then she put her hands flat on the kitchen table, the way Margaret had put her hands flat on Uncle Ellis's kitchen table the night David Adler told her what the numbers were. And Darlene said, in a voice that was not the telephone honey voice, not the big sister voice, not any voice Margaret had heard from her in many years, "Margaret. Oh, Margaret. Uncle Ellis. Oh, my lord." Darlene sat there for a long time. Margaret let her. Finally, Darlene said, "You should have told me. You should have told me earlier." "I couldn't, Darl. I'm sorry. There were legal reasons. There were reasons for everything. But I'm telling you now." I laughed at that, Barn. "Margaret," I said, "you'd do better setting a match to it." "Darl, everybody said that. I almost said it to myself. That's not. I said it with my mouth, Margaret. I said it to you. My own baby sister." "Darl, listen, I'm not here to collect an apology. I'm here because you're my sister and I wanted you to hear this from me and not from a newspaper or some cousin who heard it from someone else. I want us to be okay. I want us to be better than we've been. I'm going to set up a college fund for your grandkids if you'll let me. I already have Kayla taken care of. I have Daniel taken care of. There's plenty. Not 318 million. Most of that went where it belonged. But there's plenty, Darl. I'd like to help." Darlene cried then. Properly, a real and complete cry, of a kind Margaret had not seen her sister do since their mother's funeral. When Darlene finally looked up, her mascara had run badly, but she did not move to fix it. "Mark," she said, "forgive me, please, for all of it. Not just the barn. Everything. All these years. I have not been a good sister to you. Darl, I forgave you a long time ago. You were doing the best you knew how. That's generous. You shouldn't have had to." "It wasn't generous. It was just accurate." Darlene laughed, wetly, and Margaret laughed too, and they sat in that immaculate kitchen in Bowling Green for another hour talking, and Margaret thought, when she finally stood up to leave, that she and her sister were, at 46 and 51, perhaps starting something they should have started 30 years ago. By late spring of that year, the story had broken, as these stories always eventually do. It broke first in a small item in a trade publication for restitution attorneys, a technical description of a large case settled between a Manhattan firm and an unnamed family represented through a newly formed trust. It broke second, and more widely, in an article in a New York newspaper that picked up the thread and made inquiries and eventually published a careful, respectful, detail-rich story under the headline "A Tobacco Barn in Kentucky and the Last Message of Isaac Rosenfeld." Margaret was interviewed for that article by a journalist who came to the farmhouse in Kentucky and spent 2 days with her, walking the property with her, sitting at Uncle Ellis's kitchen table with her, letting her tell the story in her own voice and at her own pace. The journalist, a woman named Naomi Berger who was herself the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, did not sensationalize. She did not exaggerate. She did not turn Margaret into a cartoon of sainted virtue, and she did not turn Uncle Ellis into a folk hero. She simply wrote what had happened, and she wrote it beautifully. And when Margaret read the article in the kitchen of the trailer the morning it was published online, she cried a little, and she called Hannah Rosenfeld Stern, and they talked for an hour about what Naomi had managed to capture. The article, as articles like that do, went everywhere. It was syndicated into a dozen other papers. It was translated into half a dozen languages. It was read in Vienna, in Jerusalem, in Buenos Aires, in London. People began to write to Margaret. They wrote long letters in longhand, on unlined paper, describing their own grandparents, their own family stories, their own unanswered questions. They wrote from Texas, from Poland, from Australia, from South Africa. They wrote to thank her. They wrote, sometimes, to ask her for help finding their own lost family things, which broke her heart because she could not help them. Only Mr. Adler's firm and others like it could, and she forwarded each such letter to David Adler's office, and he, to his credit, responded to every single one personally. Local reaction in Greenville, Margaret had worried about. She had expected the gossip. She had expected the resentment. She had expected, in the privately competitive way of small towns, the long quiet disapproval of people who had known her in her worst year and now had to reconcile that knowledge with the story in the newspaper. Some of that happened. Some women at the grocery store suddenly could not quite meet her eyes. A few old acquaintances sent her awkward little notes. One cousin she had not spoken to in 15 years called to suggest that he had always believed in her and had been meaning to get back in touch. Margaret, who was by now getting pretty good at this, thanked him politely and did not call back. But most of Greenville, she was pleased to find, was kind. Her pastor came to the trailer and prayed with her and did not ask for a dime, only that she consider letting the church community use her story, with her permission, as an encouragement for others going through hard seasons. The principal of Kayla's high school called to say how proud they all were of Kayla and how the school would like, if Margaret would allow, to hold a small assembly in the fall where Kayla might speak briefly about her experience. Her landlord, Mr. Hensley, called her and said, with a kind of gruff embarrassment, that if there was anything in the world he could do to repay the many months of patience she had shown him back when she was paying late, he hoped she would call on him, and Margaret told him he had been a kind landlord to a woman when she had needed one, and he owed her nothing. Her old boss at the construction company, a man named Frank who had laid her off 8 months before any of this started, called her one evening and left a long, awkward message in which he said several things, including that he had always regretted the decisions made during the downsizing and that he was glad things had turned out the way they had. Margaret called him back. She did not rub it in. She simply said, "Frank, I appreciate you calling. I really do. For what it's worth, I don't hold a grudge. You were doing the best you could with what you had in front of you. I hope the business is doing better these days." Frank, on the other end of the line, cleared his throat a couple of times and said, "Margaret, you are a better woman than most of us deserve." "No, Frank," Margaret said. "I'm just a woman who had an extraordinary uncle. She did not move to Bowling Green, or to Louisville, or to New York. She stayed, with Kayla, in the trailer for the first 6 months, because she did not want any sudden change in Kayla's senior year of high school, and because she believed, in the old stubborn way of people who had worked hard for a long time, that you do not make big decisions when your emotions are still catching up to your life. She moved money around. She paid off every outstanding debt she could identify, all the way back to a small cell phone bill from 2019 that she had not even remembered she had. She paid her mother's grave marker, which had been paid for on installment for 6 years and still had several years of installments left. She paid off Roy's truck, not because she owed him anything, but because Roy had mentioned to Kayla once that his engine was making a noise, and Margaret could not stand the idea of Roy being stranded anywhere in the middle of a Kentucky winter. Roy called her when he found out and said, "Marg, you didn't have to do that." And Margaret said, "I know, Roy. I wanted to." And Roy said, "Well, thank you. That's Kayla's daddy thanking her mama, for the record." And Margaret smiled into the phone. She set up the trusts. She set them up carefully, with lawyers David Adler recommended, and she funded them generously but not recklessly. Kayla's education trust would cover her undergraduate years, any graduate study she chose, and provide a modest income in her 20s to give her the freedom to pursue work she loved rather than work that merely paid. Daniel's trust was larger because Daniel was older and his life was, in certain ways, less flexible. The trust would allow him, when his enlistment ended, to attend any school he wanted, to buy a home when he was ready, and to have a safety net that would let him say yes to the things he should say yes to and no to the things he should say no to. Margaret wrote letters to both of her children explaining the trusts, explaining that the money was not theirs to squander and was not theirs to give away wholesale, but was theirs to steward, in Uncle Ellis's sense of the word, and that she hoped they would both live lives in which they took care of it the way Uncle Ellis had taken care of the gold. She set up a smaller fund for Darlene's grandchildren, 4 of them in all, which would pay for their college educations when the time came. She did not make a fuss about it. She did not tell Darlene the full amount. She simply told her sister that it was done, and that Darlene should not worry, ever, about those kids going to school. Darlene, to her credit, did not ask questions. She only called a week later and said, in an unsteady voice, "Margaret, thank you. Those babies mean the world to me. You know that. Thank you. You'd do the same for mine, Darl." "I would. I hope I would. I'd like to think I would." "You would," Margaret said. "Let's both agree that you would. That's enough." She kept some money, of course, for herself. She kept enough that she would never worry again, which, given that she had never had enough to stop worrying, was a remarkably modest amount when she finally had it. She kept a reserve. She kept an operating fund. She put aside what she needed to live on for the rest of her life, and she calculated it carefully, using spreadsheets David Adler's firm helped her build, and when she was done, she had, in her personal accounts, an amount that was enormous by any standard she had ever known and unremarkable by the standards of the wealth that had briefly passed through her hands. She was comfortable with that. She did not want to be a woman who thought about money all the time. She had spent 8 months thinking about money, and she had found it to be a deadening way to live. She wanted to think about other things now. She discovered, to think about her uncle, to think about her daughter, to think about her son, to think about the wildflowers she would plant in the spring at the old farm, to think, for the first time in her life, about what a woman of 46 might do with the second half of a life when she is no longer required to spend it surviving. Daniel came home on leave in August. He came home looking thinner than Margaret remembered, and taller than he ever had been before, although Margaret knew that was her own eyes playing tricks on her, because Daniel had reached his full height at 20, and he was not a 19-year-old anymore. He arrived in uniform, and he walked off the small plane at the Evansville airport, and Margaret, who had not seen her son in almost 2 years, put her hand over her mouth and tried not to cry. Kayla, standing beside her, did not try. Kayla wept openly and threw herself into her brother's arms, and Daniel laughed and lifted her off the ground, and Margaret thought, "Oh, these are my children. These are my 2 children. I had forgotten what they looked like in the same room." They drove to the farmhouse that same afternoon, because Daniel had said he wanted to see it, and Margaret had wanted to show it to him. The renovations were underway. New siding, new roof, new plumbing, new wiring. The front porch had been rebuilt, stronger and wider than it had been, with a proper set of steps and a railing Margaret had designed herself. The old lane up to the house had been graveled. The fields had been plowed under in the spring and seeded. The old barn, which Margaret had decided from the very beginning would be preserved rather than restored, stood exactly where it had always stood, leaning east, its dark planks catching the August sun. Daniel stood in the yard for a long time without saying anything. He was still in uniform. He had his duffel bag on his shoulder. The wind moved through the tobacco stalks of a neighboring field and through his short sandy hair, and Margaret, watching him, thought he looked, for the first time in his life, like a grown man. "Mama," he said finally, "this is it, huh? This is it, baby. This is where he lived. That's the house right there. That's his kitchen in the front. That's his bedroom in the back. That's the wood stove, through that window. And that's the barn. That's the barn." Daniel walked toward it. Kayla and Margaret followed, a few steps behind, letting him take it at his own pace. He stopped at the big sliding doors, and he put his hand flat against one of the dark planks, and he stood there for a long, quiet moment. Then he said, without turning around, "Can we go in?" "Of course, baby." Margaret slid the door open. Daniel stepped inside. The barn's enormous interior rose around him, the tier poles running the length of the ceiling, the faint old smell of burley in the air, the light coming in through the cracks in the planks in long parallel stripes that ran across the dirt floor. Daniel stood in the center of it with his duffel bag still on his shoulder, and he looked up into the rafters, and he said, softly, "Huh. What do you see, son?" Margaret asked. "I see why he liked it," Daniel said. "I couldn't tell, from the pictures you sent. I thought it was just a big old barn. But it's not. It's a room. It's a really big room. You can hear yourself thinking here, Mama." "Yes, baby. You can." Daniel walked the length of the barn slowly, running his hand along the old tables of the stripping room, ducking under low beams, examining the iron hardware of the doors. When he reached the small curing room at the back, he paused. The door was locked, as it always was now, but Margaret had the key in her pocket. She unlocked it. She opened the door. She stepped aside. Daniel stood in the doorway for a long time. The floor of the curing room had been fully restored by the local tradespeople who had done the renovations. The boards were replaced, the nails set flush, the surface swept clean. There was nothing to see now. Just a small, plank-floored, plank-walled, dark old room with a single hook in the ceiling and a water stain on one wall. "This is where it was," Daniel said. "That's where it was. Under this floor." "Yes." "For 44 years." "Yes." Daniel walked into the small room. He stood in the center of it. He looked up at the ceiling. He looked at the water stain. He looked down at the floor under his boots. Then he knelt, slowly, and he placed his palm flat on the plank floor, and he closed his eyes, and he stayed there for what Margaret would later recognize, in retrospect, as the longest single moment she had ever watched her son live through in her life. When he finally stood, his eyes were wet. "Mama," he said. He was alone with this for a long time. "Yes, baby." He was. "You weren't alone with it, though. I had Kayla, and then I had Mr. Adler, pretty fast. I wasn't alone with it the way Uncle Ellis was." "Good," Daniel said. "That's good. I'm glad." He turned to her, and he opened his arms, and Margaret walked into them and pressed her face against her son's uniform jacket, which smelled of airports and aircraft and travel and her son, and she let herself be held for a long, quiet moment. And Kayla, standing in the doorway of the curing room with her arms crossed over her chest, watched them and did not say anything. That evening, at Uncle Ellis's kitchen table, the three of them ate supper together. Margaret had made a pot roast, because it was the thing her children had always loved most and the thing, besides fried chicken, that she was best at cooking. Daniel ate 3 helpings. Kayla, home from her summer job for the weekend, just to see her brother, ate 2. Margaret ate slowly and mostly watched, because one of the strange quiet pleasures of her new life was watching her children be well-fed in a kitchen that had once belonged to a man who had quietly hoped, for years, that she would eventually come back. After supper, Daniel asked if they could all go sit on the front porch for a while, and they did. The Kentucky evening was warm and loud with cicadas. The moon was just coming up over the eastern fields. Margaret had put a pitcher of iced tea out on the little wooden table she had made herself the week before. Daniel sat on the porch swing, Kayla tucked under his arm. Margaret sat in the rocking chair Uncle Ellis had built decades ago, which had been in the farmhouse when she first walked in, and which she had kept exactly where he had always kept it, facing the barn. For a long time, nobody spoke. They listened to the cicadas. They watched the moonlight begin to silver the roof of the old barn. Somewhere far off, a hound dog barked. "Mama," Daniel said eventually, "I want to tell you something." "Go ahead, son." "When I was in country, a couple years back, I almost re-enlisted without telling you. I was going to sign on for another 4-year hitch. I had the papers. I was going to do it. And the reason was, I didn't know what I was going to do when I got out. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have any money. I knew you didn't have any money to help me start anything. I thought, well, the Army at least pays. At least I know what the next 4 years look like." "Daniel, let me finish, Mama. I didn't sign. You know why? My buddy Perez, he said to me, 'Hollis, that's a bad reason to re-up. You re-up because you love the work, not because you're scared of what's outside.' And I thought about that for about a week, and I decided he was right. So I didn't sign. I was going to come home at the end of my hitch and figure something out. Bus tables if I had to. Go back to school on the GI Bill if I could swing it. I had no plan, Mama. I had no plan at all." Margaret listened. "And now," Daniel said, "now I have a plan. Or I have the chance of a plan. Because what you did, Mama, what you and Uncle Ellis did, it gave me room, Mama. It gave me room to think about what I actually want to do with my life. Not what I can afford to do. What I want to do. And I want you to know, I am not going to waste that. I am not going to squander a single dollar of what Uncle Ellis left and what you steward. I am going to use it to become the kind of man he was. Quiet, patient, honest. The kind of man who can be trusted with something heavy. That's what I want to be, Mama. And I want to thank you and Uncle Ellis for giving me the room to try." Margaret, rocking gently in Uncle Ellis's chair, looking at her son and her daughter together on the porch swing under the rising Kentucky moon, could not speak for a long moment. Finally, she said, "Son, that's the most beautiful thing I ever heard anybody say to me in my life." "It's true, Mama. I know it is. That's why it's the most beautiful." The small wooden memorial building next to the barn was completed in late October of that first year. It was about 400 square feet, constructed by local craftspeople in the vernacular style of Kentucky tobacco barns, its proportions deliberately echoing the big leaning barn beside it, so that the two would stand together as one structure with two purposes. Inside, the single room held photographs, translated papers, and artifacts telling the story of Isaac and Miriam Rosenfeld, of Vienna in 1938, of the unknown intermediary who had carried the cash across Europe and across an ocean and across most of a country and buried it in a Kentucky field, and of the quiet Kentucky farmer named Ellis Hollis who had found it in 1979 and carried its weight for the rest of his life. The room was, Hannah Rosenfeld Stern told Margaret on the afternoon it opened, one of the most honest rooms she had ever stepped into. It was open to visitors by appointment. It was free of charge. It was run, on a volunteer basis, by Margaret herself, with occasional visits from Kayla on weekends home from school. The barn itself, the enormous leaning black-planked barn, was stabilized, reinforced, and preserved exactly as it had been. Margaret did not restore it to some gleaming, polished version of itself. She kept the lean. She kept the rust on the tin roof. She kept the old sliding doors. She had them repaired but not replaced. Inside, the small curing room was left empty, but a simple plaque on the wall beside its doorway read, in plain engraved letters, "In this room, for more than 4 decades, a single man kept a heavy secret safe. He did this alone. He did this without reward. He did this because he believed a stranger's property should be returned to its rightful owners. At the end of his life, he asked his niece to finish what he could not. She did. That was all the plaque said. Margaret had written it herself. She had shown it to Kayla and to David Adler and to Hannah Rosenfeld Stern before it was installed, and each of them, separately, had said the same thing, which was that she should not change a word. So she did not. The opening of the memorial was small and private. Hannah Rosenfeld Stern came, with her 2 sons and their wives and her 4 grandchildren. Rebecca, the professor from Philadelphia, came. David Adler came. Rachel Weinstein came. Mr. Teague, the lawyer from Owensboro who had handed Margaret the keys in the first place, came, and so did his wife, because his wife had told him she absolutely would not miss it. Kayla drove home from college for the weekend. Daniel could not get leave, but he sent a long letter that Margaret read aloud in the memorial room, and by the time she finished reading it, half the people in that room were crying. Hannah spoke briefly. She stood at the front of the room, in front of a framed photograph of her grandfather in his Vienna office, and she said, in her small accented voice, "My grandfather wrote that he trusted in the decency of strangers. Today, in this room, I am standing with strangers who have become, to me and to my family, something closer than strangers. I do not know exactly what to call what they have become. I only know that the word friends is not large enough. The word family is not quite right either, because we are not family by blood. There is, perhaps, a word in some language I do not speak that would fit this. In English, I do not know. I only know that this room, and this barn, and this farm, and this small Kentucky town are now a part of the Rosenfeld family story for as long as there is a Rosenfeld family left to tell the story. And that the Hollis family, and most especially a man named Ellis who never met any of us, will be remembered by every generation of my descendants as long as I have any say in what they are taught. That is what I wanted to say. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Kayla. Thank you, Daniel, in your absence. And thank you, Ellis, wherever you are. Thank you." Margaret did not speak at the opening. She had decided in advance that she would not. She was not, she had learned, a woman who did well with microphones and prepared remarks. What she did, instead, after Hannah had spoken and after the small crowd had finished the refreshments she and Kayla had set out on a long table by the door, was walk with Hannah out of the memorial and across the yard to the big barn. She slid the door open. She and Hannah stepped inside, just the 2 of them, and they walked the length of the center aisle together, and Margaret showed Hannah the tier poles and the stripping room and the small curing room, and she let Hannah stand in the doorway of that curing room in silence for as long as Hannah wanted to. Margaret, Hannah said finally. May I ask you something? Of course. Is it strange to own the building in which this happened? Sometimes, yes. What do you feel when you are here alone? Margaret thought for a moment. I feel, she said, like I am standing in a church, Hannah. Not a sad church. A kind one. A place where something important was taken care of by someone who didn't have to. I feel like I can hear my uncle in here. Sometimes, although he doesn't speak. He just sits with me. I feel like he is telling me I did all right. You did more than all right, Margaret. I know. He's told me that too. In his own quiet way. Hannah smiled. She turned to look at Margaret in the dim, striped light of the barn, and she said, I would like to come back here every year, Margaret, if that is all right with you. For as long as I am able. Just once a year. Just to walk through this room. Just to remember. Hannah, Margaret said, you come any time you want. You bring whoever you want. This place belongs to your family as much as it belongs to mine. Thank you, my dear. They walked out of the barn together, and the October light was golden on the fields, and the small crowd at the memorial was laughing gently over coffee and pie. And Margaret Hollis, in her good blue dress and her good shoes, with her daughter beside her, and her son in her heart, and her uncle in the ground, and her new friends all around her, thought, for a long quiet moment, that she was probably, right now, in the most grace-filled moment of her whole life, and that she should remember it, because there would not be another one exactly like it. On the first anniversary of that raw November morning, when she had sat at her trailer's kitchen table with an eviction notice and $68.42, Margaret Hollis sat at her uncle's kitchen table in the restored farmhouse and wrote a letter of her own. She wrote it slowly, in pencil, on lined paper, the way Uncle Ellis had written his. She wrote it to herself. She wrote it, in a way, to every woman who has ever sat at a kitchen table believing she had run out of options. She wrote it because she had learned, over the course of 1 year, that the things you do when you have nothing left to lose are the things that teach you who you have actually been all along. Dear self, she wrote, 1 year ago today, you had $68. You thought you were going to lose your home. You thought your children were going to be disappointed in you. You thought you had failed. Everyone in your life, with one or two quiet exceptions, had told you that you had no future, and you were close, so close, to believing them. Then a letter came from a lawyer. You drove to a barn. You listened to your daughter ask you why the tools were sleeping, and you decided to wake them up. You pried up a board 3 boards in from the door in a cold, dark curing room, and you held a gold bar in your hands, and you did not spend a single ounce of it on yourself without first doing the right thing by other people. You found a family that had lost theirs. You gave them back what was theirs. You took only what was yours. You took it with a clear heart. You learned, this year, that you were never as small as the world told you that you were. You learned that an ordinary woman, in an ordinary coat, in an ordinary truck, on an ordinary dirt road, can do something extraordinary if she refuses to rush, and refuses to lie, and refuses to listen to the people who laughed at her barn. You learned that your uncle loved you, that he watched you across all those years of your life, and he saw something in you that you could not see in yourself, that he believed you would stand still long enough to listen. He was right. You did stand still. You did listen. You are not done. There is still so much work. There are still letters to answer. There are still people who need help finding things. There is still a farm to tend. There is still a daughter to raise the rest of the way, and a son to love when he comes home, and a sister to keep calling even when you are tired, and a quiet man in the Kentucky ground whose memory deserves to be spoken out loud by as many mouths as will speak it. But you, Margaret Ellen Hollis, of Greenville, Kentucky, you have been given back to yourself. And now, from here, you go forward. With love and gratitude, yourself. She folded the letter. She placed it inside the same envelope in which Uncle Ellis's letter to her had arrived. The original envelope, creased and softened by her own hands over a year of opening and closing it. She set the envelope inside the glass case in the small library room she had built at the back of the farmhouse, beside her uncle's ledger and his weather book and his spiral notebook and the photograph of Isaac Rosenfeld in his Vienna office in 1936. Then she walked outside. It was dusk. The light over the 17 acres of tired Kentucky ground was turning the color of old brass. The fields, which in November of the previous year had been choked with dead stalks, had been plowed under in the spring and seeded with clover and native grasses, and now they moved in long, slow waves under a light wind. The corn crib, which had been collapsed, was gone. The pump house had a new roof. The old oak tree, the one that had come down in the storm in 1979 and revealed the strongbox buried beneath it, still lay at the edge of the lower field where Margaret had decided to leave it, and she had planted around it, the previous spring, a small circle of trilliums and Virginia bluebells, because Hannah Rosenfeld had mentioned, on the telephone one afternoon, that her grandmother Miriam had loved wildflowers and had grown them, from seed, on the fire escape of her walk-up in Brooklyn for 50 years. The great old barn stood against the dusk sky, leaning east as it always had, its dark planks drinking up the last of the light. Margaret walked to its big sliding doors. She slid the eastern door open, just a little, and she stepped inside, and she stood in the long, cold, empty center aisle with the tier poles above her and the faint decades-old smell of burley in the air around her. And she looked up into the rafters, and she spoke aloud. "Uncle Ellis," she said, "I did the work. It is done. They know now. Everybody who should know knows. I did not rush. I did not lie. I did not spend a dime of it that was not clearly mine to spend. I did it the way you asked." The barn made no sound. The wind moved, once, gently, through the high wooden cracks. "And I am happy, Uncle Ellis," she said. "I want you to know. I am happier than I have been in a long, long time. Kayla is happy. Daniel is safe. Darrell and I are talking. I built you a library in the farmhouse. I built a little memorial next to the barn for the Rosenfelds. I kept the lean in the eastern wall, because I thought you'd like that. I kept everything I could. I think you would be, I hope you would be, proud." She paused. The light through the plank gaps dimmed, turning blue. "I'm going to stop coming out here every night, Uncle Ellis," she said quietly. "Not because I don't want to. Because it's time to live a little, like you told me to. You'll still be here. The barn'll still be here. I'll come back on the anniversaries, and I'll come back when I need to think something through. But I'm going to go inside and make myself some dinner now. And tomorrow I'm going to drive over to the college and take my daughter out to lunch. And the day after that I'm going to finish the new bookshelves for the library room. And life is going to keep going on, in that good steady way you always said was the best kind of life. And I'm going to be a living woman and not just a caretaker for the past. Because that's what you told me to do. Not in so many words. But I read between yours, Uncle Ellis. I read between all of them. I think I know what you meant." She waited a moment. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. For believing in me before I could believe in myself. I love you, Uncle Ellis. I hope wherever you are, it's warm, and there's coffee, and Miriam Rosenfeld is there to tell you, in person, what her family would have said if they could." She slid the barn door shut. She padlocked it. She walked back across the darkening yard to the farmhouse, and the light in the kitchen window was warm and yellow against the blue of the evening, and her shadow stretched long in front of her as she walked, and inside, on the stove, a pot of soup she had set to simmer before she came out was ready, and the kettle was just beginning to whistle. Margaret Hollis, formerly of a trailer outside of Greenville, Kentucky, presently of the old Hollis farm, 47 years old now, no longer evicted, no longer afraid, no longer small in her own mind, opened the door of her uncle's farmhouse and stepped inside to her dinner, and her future, and the long, quiet second half of her good and ordinary and extraordinary life. The barn stood behind her in the dusk, leaning east. It held no more secrets. It held only memory now, which is a lighter weight and a better one. And the wind moved through the clover in the lower field, and the fallen oak tree lay quiet in its circle of wildflowers. And somewhere, in a small apartment in New York, Hannah Rosenfeld sat down to dinner with her own grandchildren, and lit a candle, and said grace, and began, quietly, to tell them, one more time, the story of a stranger in Kentucky who had been decent when decency was almost nowhere to be found. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.